Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Should be a great conversation. Took a night off last night. Gave you all an opportunity to watch the great conversation I did with Jyoti and Harpal Brar. But now we are back. It is December 8th, and we are back, and we are ready for a great, great show tonight. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We are going to have a great conversation tonight, and away we go.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. So glad to be here with you. So glad to be here with you. Just a few quick things to talk about tonight. No, I'm just kidding. I have plenty of things to talk about here tonight. I was just checking on a couple things. I just posted in the chat my interview with Vitkor Bout. Vitkor Bout is free, and we will definitely be talking about that. Another thing coming up later in the broadcast. Oh, I got to get this out of the screen there. Another thing coming up later in the broadcast, we're going to talk about Vitkor Bout. We're also going to talk about this great new book by the great Peter Coffin. This is awesome. I'm going to be reading some of this out loud to you all because this is really, really good, and it's really, really important. Peter Coffin's new book on degrowth. I just got my copy today, and it is tremendous. And so we're going to do some reading from it. So that's coming up later in the broadcast. Also got some other things to comment on. So the way this works generally on these streams is I give opening remarks. And while I give those opening remarks, I am writing down your super chat questions. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of the program, by all means, send me a super chat. I will write it down. And then in the second half of the program, I will answer it. After I finish the opening remarks that I make, I will do the roll call. We'll find out who it is on the other side of the screen. We'll find out who's on the other side of the camera. It'll be really, really awesome. We'll find out who's watching. It's always a very, very diverse crowd of people from many, many different locations watching our show. And then after that, I answer super chat questions for the rest of the night. So let me emphasize that the second half of the show is all you. You guys ask the questions that get me talking. And that's what makes the second half of our program so enjoyable. So if you have something you'd like me to address in the second half of our show, just send me a super chat and I will write it down. And then the second half of the show is just me going through the list. Boom, 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 boom. I just start answering super chats. That's how the second half of our show goes. So if you have something you want me to talk about, you have something you want me to speak about, send a super chat and I will put it on the list and it will be addressed in the second half of the show. So I guess I'll jump into the opening remarks for now. Folks, there's some great news. At 8:30 this morning, Joe Biden made an announcement. And that announcement was that Brittany Griner, the basketball player, was on her way home from Russia. She was a basketball player who had been arrested for bringing drugs into Russia. She had come into Russia with a bottle of cannabis oil, which is an illegal controlled substance in Russia. and she was charged with a crime. She was arrested for that in February. However, she was returned this morning. There was a prisoner swap in Abu Dhabi, and she was traded for someone who has been detained and held in a federal prison in the United States for over 15 years. And that individual is Vitkor Bout. And I have interviewed Vitkor Bout. In fact, I'm posting in the chat. Vitkor Bout talked to me from his federal prison in Colorado. We had a chat in 2019. And from what I understand, Vitkor Bout, he actually specifically requested that I talk to him. So, I mean, he's a regular viewer of RT. They do have RT, or they did, not anymore, but they used to get RT America in federal prisons. And he watched RT and he wanted to talk to Caleb. So, he'd done a lot of interviews with Russian language media before, but he wanted to talk to me. And so it was arranged, and I chatted with Vitkor, and our whole interview, I just posted it, the full unedited 15-minute conversation between me and Vitkor. It's right here. And you can watch it. I spoke with Vitkor, and Vitkor is now at home with his wife and kids. And you have to look at this. There's a lot of people that are commenting on this, and they're saying, oh, like this basketball player, she didn't do anything wrong. She just had weed, and they traded her for this Vitkor Bout, who's an arms dealer and a criminal, blah, 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 blah. Vitkor Bout didn't do anything wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. They couldn't prove that Vitkor Bout had done anything. They could not. There was not a single crime that he committed that they were able to convict him of. Vitkor Bout, all he was convicted of was they sent FBI agents pretending to be FARC rebels, met with him, and they had a hypothetical conversation about a possible business deal in Thailand, mind you. So it wasn't in the United States. It was a hypothetical conversation. And then U.S. officials grabbed him and dragged him from Thailand to the United States. He had a sham trial, and he's been held in U.S. federal prisons ever since. And they wouldn't even let him visit his wife and kids. And when he got to the United States, they actually tried to get him to talk against the Russian government. They said if he would talk against Putin and against the Russian government, that they would give him and his wife and kids visas, and he could live in America. They'd let him go, and he could stay in America. That's what they offered him. But he didn't have any dirt to talk about. He's just like, no, I mean, I don't have anything to say. And that shows how ruthless they are. And he's been in federal prison ever since. When Donald Trump got elected, Donald Trump arranged that his wife and kids could come visit him. It was the first visit he'd had with his wife and kids in 10 years that he'd been held in the prison. Then you throw into that that he was held in solitary confinement for a lengthy period when he was first in federal prison. I mean, it's awful what they've done to Vitkor Bout. For 15 years, this man has been sitting in a federal prison for nothing, for nothing, really, because he's a Russian, because he's a prominent Russian who is was a supporter of the Russian government, because he came to the aid of the people of Angola and supported the MPLA of Angola. And during the Soviet years, when the Soviet Union still existed, he helped arrange, allegedly, for the Soviet Union to send weapons to the people of Angola to fight against the U.S.-backed terrorists in UNITA that were being backed by the United States, the literal cannibals armed by America to attack the people of Angola, to help the people of Angola defend themselves from apartheid South Africa. The apartheid government of South Africa invaded. Cuba sent their troops to Angola to aid the people of Angola against apartheid, against the invaders. And Vitkor Bout, it's alleged, we don't know for sure, but it's alleged Vitkor Bout arranged for weapons to go to Angola so they could defend themselves from the apartheid government. And, as Putin came back into office, Vitkor Bout, was somebody who recognized that Putin was helping the country. He was a businessman. He ran a cargo business, but he recognized that that Victor Bout recognized that Putin was fixing the country, and he was sympathetic to the efforts to make Russia a stronger country. He had a background in in the Soviet military, and his father had been a bookkeeper, and he had been in the Soviet military, and he had a background in the international solidarity work that the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union supported all kinds of freedom fighters all over the world, the Palestinians and black people in America and in Central America, the Sandinistas. And so he had a background in this kind of international work, the international solidarity that the Soviet Union did. And he ran a cargo business, right? It was his business. It was a private business. And he was sympathetic to the Russian government. And one thing that I think is fascinating is before they got him, right? Before they ultimately, before they dragged him out of Thailand, they started by making a Hollywood hate movie about him. It started with the British, right? It always seems to start with the British, doesn't it? Right? Doesn't it always seem to start with the British? Doesn't it seem to always start with the British? We now know that the head Jankowicz, Nina Jankowicz, she's now a registered agent of the British government. And, it always seems to start with the British. But the British Foreign Office labeled him the Merchant of Death. And they came up with all these concocted stories about people he was selling weapons to, which couldn't be proven. They made a Hollywood movie about him. Did you see this? They made a Hollywood movie about him, which is nothing to do with the truth, right? It's fiction. They made a movie about this guy. And then finally, after they'd made movies about this guy, there were books published by major publishers calling him the Merchant of Death and demonizing him. And then finally, after all of that, they kidnapped him from Thailand. And they couldn't find any laws that Victor had actually violated. That's the scariest thing. He hadn't broken the law. It's not illegal to run a cargo company. It's not illegal to be a supporter of Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's not illegal to have been in the Soviet military and helped the people of Africa fight for their freedom. It's not illegal to have been in the Soviet military, and have helped, people in Latin America who are fighting for their freedom. None of that is illegal. None of that is illegal. It is not illegal to be a person in the Soviet Union and carry out Soviet foreign policy. None of that is illegal. So they couldn't find a way to actually get him. But they got all of the stupid Hollywood celebrities, all the Save Darfur people, George Clooney and Angelina Jolie and all of them out there. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh God. There's this man who's selling guns and save the children. It became one of those trendy causes to stop Victor Bout. Oh, we got to stop Victor. Oh, didn't you see the movie? I was crying in the movie, in this Hollywood movie. It's not real. Victor Bout was hurting people. Oh, we got to stop him. I saw it. It's in a movie. It has to be real. Hollywood wouldn't lie. Oh, it has to be true. And they did this. And it wasn't the conservatives who were out to get Victor. No. It was the liberals. It was those Hollywood liberals. It was Sean Penn. Sean Penn. All of them were out there. And it was the trendy liberal cause, right? My God, there's something to be said. I've been thinking about this, but as much as conservatives, I grew up around a lot of conservatives, and they annoyed me. But there's something about liberals that is also annoying, right? There's this highfalutenness, conservatives. I mean, you want them to go see a movie. You make a movie that looks like it'll entertain them. They'll go see it, right? Hey, it's a good movie, right? They want to go see American Sniper, and looks like a movie they would like. They go see American Sniper. But like with liberals, you sell them a movie as like watching it as a moral act, right? By going to this movie, I am taking a moral stand. I remember when the movie Blood Diamond came out, right? The movie Blood Diamond came out, and I was talking to somebody who, this person I know, and they were telling me, oh, this Blood Diamond is an important film. And they were just so proud of themselves for having gone to see Blood Diamond. Oh, I went to see Blood Diamond. Yes, it's so important that we raise awareness about conflict diamonds. I am better than you because I went to go see Blood Diamond. Did you see Blood Diamond? Of course. I bet you went and watched The Avengers. But I am a highly ethical and moral person, you see, and so I went to go see Blood Diamond because I care about little African children. I'm just like Queen Elizabeth. I like to go pat little children on the head and talk about conflict diamonds. And, you know, I'm an ethical, moral person. And so I went and saw the boring Hollywood movies starring Sean Penn and Angelina Jolie and George Clooney, all about conflict diamonds. And, oh, I'm so proud of myself. I'm so proud of myself. It's like they're not actually selling you a good movie. They're selling you the smug bragging rights for seeing the fucking movie. That's what they're selling you when they sell you the movie, right? It's like, it doesn't have to be a good movie. You just have to feel good about yourself for having gone, right? So they made one of these movies about Victor, right? About how bad Victor is, about, oh, there's this, the what is it? The Lord of War, the Merchant of Death, and all kinds of smug college professors and small town lawyers and doctors got to dress their kids up in little sweaters and drive to the movie theater and sit in the movie theater and feel so morally proud of themselves. No, we don't see violent movies. No. We didn't go see the new South Park movie. We're not disgusting. We watched Lord of War, and we learned about this evil person named Vitkor Bout who's going around harming innocent children, and why it is the moral imperative of the U.S. government to drag him away. We must stop him. We must save Darfur. We must save Ukraine. We must save Taiwan, and we must drag away Julian Assange and Vitkor Bout. Don't you love that smug? Don't you hate the smug? Don't you hate it? Don't you really, really hate it? Don't you really, really hate it? You know, I mean, so heroic to echo the interests of the U.S. government. You know, it's such a courageous stand to be against Russia in America, right? I mean, it's almost as heroic as being against Saddam Hussein. I remember when I was in college, I took comparative politics, and in like a college class, they showed us a 60-minute hit piece on North Korea. And I'm watching this 60-minute hit piece on North Korea. And I'm thinking, I'm in college. I can watch 60 minutes at home, and like 60 minutes is not highfalutin academic material, right? At the time, I'd read Bruce Cummings and I'd studied the history of Juche and all this. But in college, I'm sitting there and they're showing us a 60 minutes hit piece on North Korea. And I'm watching it. In this 60 minutes hit piece they've got on North Korea, they've got this German guy. And he's like, oh, I am a German, and I heard that in North Korea, the people have no food. And I know as a German, we did nothing about Holocaust. And so now as German, it is my responsibility to condemn the North Korea because it is just like Holocaust. Kim Jong-un is just like Hitler. And I am so moral by being against North Korea. And it's like, shut up. Oh, you're against North Korea in Germany. Oh, wow. I'm just so proud of you for your heroism. I mean, you're just you're sticking it to the man. You hate a government that's demonized 24/7 on American television. I mean, how do you have the courage to do that? I just want to slap George Clooney. I want to slap Angelina Jolie. I want to slap Sean Penn, and I want to slap the German who is so outraged about North Korea. It is like Holocaust. Yeah. There's a big difference there, Mr. German, because when the Holocaust was going on, that was your government doing it, right? So taking a stand against it actually meant going against what all the media and all the government was telling you. So you being in Germany and saying, oh, I hate Kim Jong-il, he is murderer. By doing that in Germany in the year 2004, you're not being heroic. Being heroic in Germany in the 1930s would have meant being against Hitler because he was in Germany. You see, that's generally how these things work. But anyway, enough about that. I hate the smug. I really, really hate the smug. And when Rush Limbaugh died, I hated Rush Limbaugh. I still am not a big fan of his. And I will never forget. I'll just touch on this a little bit more. When Rush Limbaugh died, Rush Limbaugh was this awful, awful neocon, champion of austerity, anti-union, free trade, pro-war conservative. But when Rush Limbaugh died, you would have thought, his obituaries all went like this. Once upon a time, there was a man who liked Donald Trump. And it's like, no. Once upon a time, there was a disgusting, smug, conservative bully, who tore down poor people on television and was anti-union, but no, that was the way they framed it up. It's like, once upon a time, there was a guy who liked Trump. Shame on him. It was like, the past doesn't matter. But you watch some of the early Rush Limbaugh material, right? When he was just starting out in like the 80s, when Rush Limbaugh was just getting like national fame, this is what he's making fun of. And this is how he became popular. He was making fun of that smug, right? Like one of his early segments was about, how liberals, had this program to help homeless people that was ridiculous. And he did a really, really good job of ridiculing the fact that, liberals want to feel good about themselves for fighting homelessness. So they started a program to give homeless people free shopping carts to live in. That's pretty hilarious, right? And he's on there. He's like, what is this? They're giving people free shopping carts? What is this? If I was your friend and I said, I wish you well, here's a shopping cart to live in. He's right. He's absolutely right. And he was making fun of this program that like wealthy liberals had this nonprofit, this charity to give homeless people free shopping carts to live in. And that just shows how, like, if you really care about homeless people, give them a goddamn house. Give them food, give them shelter, but you care about somebody who's living on the street and you're like, oh, you're living on the street. Here's a shopping cart. That's a pretty sophisticated, he's pointing out the arrogance of these people. But let me scroll up. There's a few super chats I got to write down. So thank you, folks, we got John McCarthy. All right. All right. Okay. And just want to make sure I get down everyone's super chat. Don't worry. I see it. So, all right. All right. And there you go. So, he did a good job, and that's, people don't like that, right? People do not like that smugness about liberals. So when they made their Lord of War film about some, educating audiences about some Russian guy they've never heard of and why they should hate him, they were just setting the stage for repression of an anti-imperialist, right? Targeting of an anti-imperialist country. But also, this is what cancel culture is. This is what cancel culture is. Okay. And this is what I wish people could understand. I want to shake people sometimes. I just want to shake them. Right. And when I talk about wanting to slap people and I talk about wanting to shake people, I can want a lot of different things. That doesn't mean I'm going to do it. Okay. So it's not a threat. Let me just get that out there. I do not advocate violence or assaults against anyone. But when I hear people, I hear all the time, right? I mean, people have it in their minds that, like, mainstream media demonizing somebody is coming from a good place. They have this in their minds, and they don't understand. Like, Vitkor Bout didn't violate the law. He didn't do anything illegal. He's a Russian guy. He did business in countries other than the United States. They had no legal means of getting this guy. Oh, that's an interesting one. Difference between Glenn Beck, O'Reilly, Hannity, and Limbaugh. They had really no interest and they had no legal grounds to get him. But they created this, like, this moral indignation campaign based on bullshit, right? Where they made these, tear-jerking Hollywood movies about how evil Vitkor Bout truly is. Oh my God, and he's horrible. And they showed him in a movie being this awful guy. So they were canceling him. That's what they were doing. And they were building the case for repression. And that's what cancel culture is. And that's what these people don't understand. People don't get it. That before they invade Iraq, I remember before the USA invaded Iraq, they did all these 2020, 60-minute hit pieces full of bullshit about Saddam Hussein. And they had this thing about Saddam Hussein had thrown people in wood chippers and Saddam Hussein this and Saddam Hussein that. And it was propaganda. In order to justify the war, in order to build the case for the war, they whipped up a demonization campaign, right? And Oprah was in on it. She interviewed Ahmed Chalabi, and she had Ahmed Chalabi on the show, and she said to was it Ahmed Chalabi? No, was he in Afghanistan? But they interviewed this Iraqi guy, on Oprah's show before the invasion, and she said, Now, let me ask you, do the Iraqi people want America to invade Iraq? And he said, yes, we do. Yes, we do. I mean, it was like, in order to build the case for war, they did a demonization campaign. And they did the same thing with Julian Assange, if you'll remember. They accused him of rape, and it was false. And then Michael Moore was defending Julian Assange. And then they did this whole moral thing, how dare you defend a rapist? Oh my God, and they did this whole moral thing against Michael Moore for having defended Julian Assange. And, this is how they operate. This is how they operate. And at cancel culture, it's not just finding out that someone's bad and people then take a stand on the internet against them. It serves a political purpose. It serves a political purpose. That's what it does, right? It serves a political purpose. And it's about building the case so they can get away with stuff, right? That's why they do it. It's about building the case. They wouldn't have gotten away with dragging Vitkor Bout out of Thailand and locking him up in the United States for 15 years. They wouldn't have gotten away with it if they hadn't spent lots of money psyching the public up for it. This is how it works. This is how it works. And these people do not get it. I swear, these people do not get it. They have it in their minds that somehow you can be against American capitalism. You can be against the Pentagon. You can be against American imperialism and agree with everything that their propaganda agencies say about everyone else. And be skeptical of everything that the forces of resistance say. I do not get it. These people, they think everything the New York Times says about Russia is true. Everything the New York Times says about China is true. Everything the New York Times says about Cuba is true. It's all true, but they're against American imperialism. And if you show them anything from Russian media or anything from Cuban media or anything from Chinese media, they go, that's propaganda, but they're anti-imperialist. No, you're not. If you can't get it through your mind that the U.S. imperialists lie, that the U.S. imperialists demonize countries in order to attack them, in order to build the case for war. If you can't get that through your mind, if in your mind it's like you're going to accept their narratives, but somehow, have it in your mind, but you're a socialist too or something, you're not. And these people don't get this. There will never be a socialism that the New York Times approves of, ever. These people have it in their minds that someday there will be a socialist revolution in some country. And the socialist revolution will win. And the New York Times will write articles about it where they say, well, this country doesn't violate human rights. This country is not corrupt in any way. We don't approve of it being socialist, but we just can't find anything wrong with it. That will never happen. That's not how it works. Every government that is anti-imperialist, that is opposing U.S. imperialism and starts building socialism, gets accused of being a brutal dictatorship. Every single one. It does not matter, right? And if you want any further proof of this, look at Venezuela. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela had the most fair and clear, transparent elections in the world, according to Jimmy Carter and the Carter Center that measures elections. They had the fairest elections in the world. They didn't have the death penalty. They had strict laws forbidding torture. They let prisoners vote. Did you know this? In Venezuela, they have voting booths in the prisons. Even the prisoners get to vote. The only people who can't vote are those serving sentences. But if you're awaiting trial, You vote, and they have a special voting booth in the jail just to make sure that you can vote. Right? Venezuela has a very transparent electoral system. Venezuela, on top of that, the opposition was everywhere. The opposition has ads on television. The opposition, they have big demonstrations and protests. They have billboards. Most of the mainstream media in Venezuela, was at one point with the opposition. But somehow Hugo Chavez was a brutal dictator. It didn't matter. He allowed, the opposition to have like 6 or 7 TV networks to demonize him all day long. They didn't care, still a brutal dictatorship. No death penalty, still a brutal dictatorship. Transparent elections that the United Nations and the Carter Center approved. He's still a brutal dictator. No matter what you do, they call you a brutal dictator, right? It does not matter. If you set up a government where they aren't in charge, they call it brutal dictatorship. That's how it works. And the same thing applies to people like Vitkor Bout, right? If they're gonna drag a prominent Russian guy, a wealthy Russian guy, out of, if they're gonna grab him, do you think they're gonna say, well, this guy is totally innocent of everything. He's an upstanding citizen who's done nothing wrong. However, we want to grab him for foreign policy purposes. You guys are okay with that, right? Of course not. In order to convince you that it's okay what they're doing, they're going to make a Hollywood movie about how he's a brutal, awful person and he's the merchant of death. He's the lord of war. That's how they work. And if you don't make a conscious choice to stop listening to their lies and stop believing them, if you don't decide I am going to listen to what anti-imperialists say, and I'm not going to believe knee-jerk what imperialists say. If you don't make a decision, you're going to be lost for your whole life because they lie over and over and over again, and anti-imperialists tell the truth. And you know why anti-imperialists tell the truth? Number one, the truth is anti-imperialist. But number two, because we're held to way higher standards. RT is held to way higher standards than CNN. CNN says absolute bullshit all the time. They said there was an ISIS flag at an LGBT pride parade in Australia. That's ridiculous. That's how stupid CNN can be. They don't even bother because they're CNN, right? However, RT, CGTN, Telesur, because they're from countries that are demonized by the United States, everything they say is constantly, they are looking for any excuse to tell you that this is propaganda. Don't believe it. So the amount of fact checking and the amount of bending over backwards to make sure that everything is accurate is far higher in alternative media, far higher in Russian media, far higher in Chinese media, far higher in Cuban and Venezuelan media and Iranian media than it is in mainstream media because they're constantly being accused of being propaganda, because they're constantly being scrutinized. They have to be more accurate. And yes, every media outlet makes mistakes. Every media outlet makes mistakes, right? That's just inevitable, right? But then you run a correction. The responsible thing to do is when you make a mistake, you run a correction, right? That's just how these things tend to work. But like anti-imperialist media has to tell the truth. It has to tell the truth because any mistake that they make is going to immediately be jumped on. The U.S. State Department has whole websites that are aimed at debunking Russian media. Did you know this? They have whole websites, and those websites don't have anything on them. The websites don't have anything. There was one article, and they don't have anything on them because we bend over backwards. Anti-imperialists, we bend over backwards, to tell the truth, right? And that's the reality of the situation. And until you realize that, until you make that leap and just come to terms with the fact that Julian Assange, in order to justify grabbing him, they're going to call him a rapist, they're going to call him a pedophile and a terrorist and a neo-Nazi and a Trump supporter, and they're going to say he pooped in his bed or he didn't feed his cat or whatever the hell, they skateboarded in the house or what. It's like you have to understand they're going to say whatever they can to serve imperialism. And then you can't trust them when they're talking about Julian Assange. And you can't trust them when you're talking about Vitkor Bout. And you can't trust them when they're talking about Iran or North Korea or Cuba or Venezuela. You can't trust them, right? Jimmy Dore, look what they've done to Jimmy Dore, right? You cannot trust American mainstream media. You can't do it, right? And until you get it through your head that that's the case, you're going to be lost. And I get very frustrated with people because in addition to demonizing countries, any country that challenges the U.S. imperialists immediately gets demonized. In addition to that, any anti-imperialist voice immediately gets demonized. Jimmy Dore, he was with the Young Turks for a long time. He's a progressive. He's a leftist. He's a pot-smoking, leftist. But the way that they've gone after Jimmy Dore, they have bent over backwards to try and convince people that Jimmy Dore is the grand wizard of the KKK. He's racist. He's awful. It's because he tells the truth. And they do the same thing to me. They do the same thing to all kinds of anti-imperialist voices, Max Blumenthal, other voices. And all these people cannot get it through their heads that this happens. If you are putting out this kind of message, they will cancel you. They will use anything they can to try and cancel you. They will. They will. They will use anything they can to try and cancel you. And if you are a genuine anti-imperialist, you have to learn to sift through the bullshit and not fall for it. And that you don't gain anything. You gain nothing. And I'm talking, there's a lot of people I would like to shake and tell them this to. You don't gain anything by going, well, I'm anti-imperialist, but don't worry, I'm not like that guy. You gain nothing. Nothing. Because if you're anti-imperialist and you're doing a good job, they will come for you the exact same way they come for the other guy, right? If I were to get on here and go, I'm anti-imperialist, but don't worry, I'm not like that Jimmy Dore guy. He's no good. Do you think that would gain me anything? Do you think they'd stop calling me a cult leader and a racist and a sexist and a Ku Klux Klan homophobe, transphobe? Do you think that would make a difference? They'd say, oh, Caleb's against Jimmy Dore. No, of course not. Do you think if I got on here and I said, I'm a communist and a patriotic socialist, but that Haas guy, he's no. Do you think they would stop going after me if I did that? Do you think that you gain anything from acting that way? You don't. It's a cowardly thing to do. It's backstabbing. And this is how they weaken our movement. They get people in the mindset that somehow they can protect themselves from getting canceled by helping cancel other people with the exact same view. And it is a trap. And I'm urging you, do not fall for it. And until you understand that they lie about every anti-imperialist country, that anti-imperialist media is way more accurate and way more factual and way more truthful, until you realize that every single person who puts forward an anti-imperialist message is going to be called a fascist and a Nazi and a white supremacist and a pedophile and a rapist and a baby-eating cannibal. Until you realize this, you are going to be lost. You're not going to be able to make sense of the world. There's actually a very good quote from Vladimir Lenin. It's a good quote from Lenin. I'm going to pull it up. It's worth taking a little time to pull it up here because this is one of the most important Lenin quotes. I'm going to pull it up. It's from his essay, The Three Components of Marxism, which is a very good essay. It's a very important essay. This is Vladimir Lenin. It's a very important quotation. He said, people always have been the foolish victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. I'm going to post that in the chat because put it to memory. People always have been the victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. That is a really important quote from Vladimir Lenin. Until you see the class interest, behind such statements, you will be the victim of deceit and self-deceit. And this is really, really important. And people need to get this, right? And I get frustrated with people for not getting this. It frustrates me that people continue to live in this world where they think they can consume imperialist media as if it's true, consume anti-imperialist media with high suspicion, or not consume it at all. Peter Coffin in the chat. Great book, by the way. Great book. I'm going to be reading from it in a little bit. Or not consume it at all and still think they know what's going on. Until you think of the class interest behind the New York Times and CNN and Twitter and Facebook, until you do that, until you realize that the reason that some socialist commentators go viral and others get shadow banned isn't because some people are just better, until you realize this, you are going to be lost. We all know that there's one great exception to that, which is Vaush. The reason that Vaush is so popular is because of his intellect. He's just a highly intelligent person, and he's also just beautiful. He's just like everyone wants to look at Vaush all day long. He's so smart and he's so sexy, right? He's like a supermodel. So, that's clearly why he's popular. So aside from Vaush, right, the only reason some socialist commentators, get widely promoted and some don't is because of manipulation. But Vaush is clearly there because of his good looks, his charisma, and his intelligence. We all know that. Like, don't get me wrong, right? But anyway, I digress. Okay. But I digress. But we need to get this. And so before they could grab Vitkor Bout, they had to build up this stupid ethical, moral, cancel culture campaign against him. And, and we need to learn not to fall for that. We really need to learn not to fall for that, right? We really do. We really do, right? That there you go. So just wanted to share that. And I want to just say how happy I am for my friend Vitkor Bout. He was charming to interview. He was so great to talk to him on the phone, listen to our conversation. It was weird. I only talked to him, twice, really. He called back later. We followed up on our conversation, but we only had that short conversation. I feel like Vitkor Bout is a friend. That is a charming guy. You know what I mean? This is a guy, and imagine the circumstances he's in. I'll post the link in the chat to the interview. This guy is in federal prison for 15 years. He can't, it takes him forever to see his wife and kids. He's away from his home country, and he's in federal prison. And I talked to him, and he's like the most charming guy, right? He's the most charming guy. He's joking with me on the phone. It was beautiful, right? That shows real strength of character. If Vitkor Bout had wanted to, I think he would have been totally justified to be on the phone with me going, I'm so angry. My life is miserable. I hate what's been done. But he talked to me on the phone. It was the most charming, friendly conversation. He's sitting in a modern day dungeon, right? He's sitting in a high security federal prison where, and he's been deprived of seeing his wife and kids, and he's locked away. And he speaks to me in the most charming voice, and he makes he name dropped Mumia Abu-Jamal in our interview, folks. He talked about Mumia Abu-Jamal, the Black Panther political prisoner, mentions him in our conversation. It's a very wide-ranging chat. So Vitkor Bout, I am so glad that he's home with his wife and kids. He has been through hell, and he is an anti-imperialist hero. He is an anti-imperialist hero. Go rip down the next Ukraine flag you see and put up a picture of Vitkor Bout, because that guy is an internationalist hero. He's a fighter for the working class, a fighter against the imperialists. Right now, the main confrontation in the world is between the big ultra monopoly corporations, the big banks, the big oil companies that dominate the world, the Silicon Valley fascists, and the forces of resistance that are trying to break out of their death trap and are trying to move toward an economy that can continue to grow and where the people and their interests come before the profits of a wealthy few. Socialism sits at the center of a much bigger and more broad anti-imperialist bloc. And that's what we have to remember. Yeah, there's a lot of wealthy capitalists in Russia. There's a lot of wealthy capitalists in China. There's a lot of, wealthy capitalists in Venezuela. But at the end of the day, the global movement of resistance is centered around socialism. Russia and China became superpowers because of socialism. Russia restored itself after the fall of the Soviet Union with state-controlled oil and natural gas. Venezuela and Bolivia and Nicaragua and these other countries that have broken free, and Cuba, it's all on the basis of socialism. The basis of anti-imperialism is socialism, and socialism is what is leading countries to break free from the domination of Western capitalism and imperialism. And socialism is the linchpin. And like many people have asked me, Caleb, do you think Russia is a socialist country? It doesn't matter. They don't believe in Marxism. I'll tell you that much. The Russian government does not believe in Marxism. That is very clear. They do not believe in Marxism. But the Communist Party does, and they're a big part of the Russian government. They're a major party in Russia, the second biggest political party after the United Russia Party. But on top of that, it doesn't matter. Why? Because Russia's economy is deeply tied in with China, and China is a socialist country. Russia's economy is deeply tied in with Cuba, and Cuba is a socialist country. They just built a monument to Fidel Castro in Russia. Russia's economy is deeply tied in with Vietnam, deeply tied in with Venezuela, deeply tied in with North Korea, deeply tied in with various socialist countries of the world. And the U.S. imperialists are doing everything they can to drive Russia out of the world economy. So all of the places in the world economy where the U.S. imperialists are able to twist arms and get things done, Russia's being put out of. And all the socialist and revolutionary countries are doing business with Russia. So is Russia technically a socialist country? No. Does that matter at all? No. Right? I mean, it might as well be. Right? I mean, they are so integrally tied into the socialist and revolutionary anti-imperialist bloc. It does not matter, right? And if you want to sit there, well, technically, Caleb, Russia is not a social. Oh, shut up. First of all, if you think that everything that the Soviet people learned from the Soviet period, you think that everything they learned just went away. You think their pride in defeating the Nazis went away? You think their solidarity with Africa just went away? You think their anti-imperialism just went away? You're delusional. Second of all, how did Putin fix Russia's economy? By reasserting state control, by putting two state-controlled megacorporations, Gazprom and Rosneft, at the center of the world economy. And where did the Russian state bureaucracy come from? Right? People always talk about Putin and his history with the security services. What security service was Putin in at one point? Right? And so if you think that there's not a huge influence of the history of the Soviet Union on Russia and modern Russia, you are delusional, right? It is a huge influence, but they've learned from it. And the Soviet Union fell for a reason. Putin always says that if you don't mourn the loss of the Soviet Union, you have no heart. But if you want to restore the Soviet Union, you have no brain. And as much as I am an admirer of the Soviet Union, I agree with him. The Soviet Union's never coming back. It went away for a reason. So this is what people need to understand. Yeah, whatever. Who cares? This is what people need to understand. I'm not here to talk smack about other anti-imperialists. Don't even try it. I wish people could understand this. I really wish people could understand how this cancel culture works. I'm glad that Vitkor Bout is home. And my heart goes out to Isabel dos Santos. Isabel dos Santos is somewhere in hiding right now, because just like they canceled Vitkor Bout for standing in solidarity with the MPLA against imperialism, standing up for African people, just like they dragged him because he had a record of standing with the people of Angola and other African countries fighting for their national liberation. They have canceled Isabel dos Santos. They've charged her with money laundering and corruption. She's fled her home country. She's fled Portugal. She's in hiding somewhere. They're trying to go after her. And now she's saying she might run for president of Angola because she thinks she could win, because she's so popular, because people remember how good the economy of Angola was when she was running it. when she was in solidarity with Russia and China running their economy. So, we celebrate the fact that Vitkor Bout is home with his wife and kids, and our heart goes out to Isabel dos Santos. Say a prayer for Isabel dos Santos. Please say a prayer for Isabel dos Santos, the real girl boss. If there's ever a girl boss who's worth praising and praying for and cheering for, it is Isabel dos Santos. She is a girl boss if there ever was one. That is what a real feminist, a real girl boss looks like. That is Isabel dos Santos. Isabel dos Santos. And we'll be talking about her in future streams. I'm going to have a lot more to say about Isabel. But anyway, now I want to turn my attention to this book by Peter Coffin. Peter Coffin's new book, which, is really good. I don't know. Did I get some water from my drink on the cover here? It's a beautiful book. I was reading it earlier. So I figured we would read from it. I'm going to start reading from chapter 1 because I read the introduction, and the introduction is comedy, and I am not Peter Coffin. I do not have Peter Coffin's delivery style. So if I were to read the introduction, which is a lot of like sarcasm and jokes and stuff, I wouldn't do it justice because it's to be read in his voice. So I'm going to start with part 1, Malthus and Overpopulation. This is from Peter Coffin's new book, Less Sucks, Overpopulation, Eugenics, and Degrowth by Peter Coffin. And I'm going to read to you from it. So important, such a good book. Surplus population is a term Charles Dickens has his famed tightwad, Ebenezer Scrooge, used to establish that the character agreed with the then popular ideas of a man named Thomas Robert Malthus. The term refers to unproductive consumers, a section of the population providing nothing socially necessary while using up valuable resources. Welfare queens, Netflix employees, and people who don't seed torrents for at least 24 hours after they're done downloading. These people just die, I guess. Anyway, Malthus, an unfortunately real person that Dickens didn't make up for a story, published an essay on the principle of population in the year 1798. Before we go into that, though, it's important to know that Malthus wasn't the first person to raise a version of this concern. Centuries earlier, Plato, noted writer of Socrates fan fiction and democracy hater, had expressed concerns about overpopulation when the Earth had only around 150 million people on it, less than 2% of today's population. In one of his most prominent works, Socrates fan fiction Republic, Plato put forward that population growth was unsustainable, not only because of the demand for food and resources, but he believed it was one of the biggest causes of war. The thing that should have clued people in on how full of shit Plato is was his idea that in a just world, philosophers would rule because only they understand what is good, and what is good cannot be seen clearly or explained. Naturally, Plato had the idea that the philosopher kings would impose legal restrictions on reproduction. Let's call them bang rules, to create balance and harmony. Obviously, the philosopher kings weren't subject to the bang rules, though, and were allowed to bang without restriction. I mean, we want more eternal smarties, right? It's all good, Peter. I'm glad I'm reading this on here. And fewer idiots buying tubs of pre-made chocolate frosting to eat as a snack, right? How could that go wrong? Clearly, then we shall next endeavor to make marriages as sacred as possible, and those most advantageous to the state will be sacred, unquestionably. How then will they go about being advantageous? Answer me that question, Glaucon. For I see in your house hunting dogs and a great number of game birds. Pray now, tell me, have you given any attention to the mating and breeding? In what particular way, he asked. Oh, it's the dialogue. It's the Platonic dialogue. I'll go on. But anyway, Plato wanted to achieve a stationary state in terms of population, believing it would end hunger, class conflict, and wars of conquest. This would be good for Plato, a philosopher, because then no one would want to oust philosophers who would rule over everyone because they knew so darn much. By the time Malthus' work became popular in the 1800s, the human population had grown to around 1 billion, over 6 times what Plato thought could be sustainable, making Plato look like a bitch. Still, Thomas Robert Malthus reintroduced to popular concern the idea that humankind would soon outgrow available resources. Like Plato, Malthus proclaimed that a finite amount of land would be incapable of supporting a population with supposedly infinite growth potential, which eventually made Malthus also look like a bitch. Let's just quote this bitch verbatim. In the first edition of the 1798 essay, Principle on the Population, Malthus asserted, population, when unchecked, increases in a geometric ratio. Substance increases only in arithmetical ratio. A slight acquaintance with the numbers will shew the immensity of the first power in comparison to the second. To break it down, Malthus' original claim is that while increases in food and resource production occur in a linear fashion, increases in population occur exponentially. Many, from the OG dialectical materialist Karl Marx to Julian Simon, a pro-market liberal environmental economist of the Chicago tradition, one of the most disciplined and concise critics of overpopulation and limits to growth study of Malthusianism in the 70s, have been able to recognize that graph as flimsy. In Theories of Surplus Value, written in 1836, Karl Marx extensively debunks Malthus' body of work. I got a copy of that right up here. Theories of Surplus Value, right? Not only noted that Malthus was a plagiarist, but also that he misrepresented and even some at times outright misunderstood the theories that he plagiarized. Then changed up justifications whenever called out. Marx wrote, Malthus' theory was taken from James Anderson. His Principles of Political Economy was a polemic work written in the interests of capitalists against the workers and in the interests of the aristocracy, church, and tax eaters, toadies, etc., against the capitalists. Where Malthus inserts his own inventions, it is pitiable. Malthus' work was a lampoon mockery directed against the French Revolution and the contemporary ideas of reform in England, Godwin, etc. It was an apologia for the poverty of the working class. Furthermore, Malthus took the Andersonian theory of rent to give his population law an economic and a real natural historical basis, while this nonsense about geometrical and arithmetical progression was purely an imaginary hypothesis. Anderson had defended premiums on corn exports and duties on corn imports, not out of any interest for the landlords, but because he believed it would reduce the average price of corn and ensure even development of productive forces in agriculture. Malthus adopted Anderson's assertion because he was a professional sycophant of the landed aristocracy to justify their position economically. Malthus defends the interests of the industrial bourgeoisie only when they're identical with the interests of the aristocracy against the mass of people, the proletariat. But where these interests diverge and are antagonistic to each other, he sides with the aristocracy against the bourgeoisie. Hence his assertion of the unproductive worker over consumption. So here's where we begin to understand what Malthus was ultimately doing. He's not defending capitalism. He is slyly attacking it, not for the right reasons, mind you, rather than identifying and criticizing the contradictions of the system and ultimately siding with the working class. He was telling the industrial capitalists to know their place in defense of the property-owning aristocracy, the church, and ultimately the feudal mode, which was crumbling and needed some support. When the interests of the working class are in direct conflict with both the industrial capitalists and the aristocracy, Malthus is happy to defend the capitalists. However, the capitalists are ultimately beneath the aristocracy, and in his eyes, their true purpose should serve the aristocracy. Today, we live in a world where the capitalists won. The feudal aristocracy has been replaced by the bourgeoisie, the previous, middle, and current ruling class, while the class for whom Malthus was a professional sycophant for all but symbolically disappeared. His theories have persisted. They have not become any less wrong, though. We produce an excess of food nowadays, so much that a lot of it goes to waste. 1/3 of food produced for human consumption is lost or globally wasted. This amounts to 1.3 billion tons per year, worth approximately $1 trillion US. Because of this argument, similar to Malthus on food, are often put forward with the substitution of generalized resources for food production. Like I said, is a severely outdated concern, though still contrasted with the world human population. In Capital Volume 3, Marx talked about the implementation of momentary and forcible solutions of the existing contradictions, violent eruptions, which restore the disturbed equilibrium for a while. Basically, the present state of affairs has become untenable as conflicts and discrepancies build, and then a series of events pacify these contradictions, albeit at great human cost. Wow. There we go. All right. Sorry, something happened to my screen there. In response to the crises, the capitalist ruling class implements policies that range from propping up massive failures of institutionalized finance capital at the expense of the worker, both here at home and abroad, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, to, well, both world wars. Prosperity at the cost of human life is achieved one way or another. Anarchically violent, destructive means are utilized to temporarily restore stability without actually eroding any of the fundamental contradictions that generate these crises. The boom part of the cycle was obviously mirrored on the human population. I mean, we called it a baby boom. It's the sole event in human history that truly embodies the conditions that the idea of Malthusian catastrophe put forward as necessary for one to happen. But much to the chagrin of hunter-gatherer fetishists, society didn't collapse. As the productive forces developed, the standard of life increased and the family model responded. People started having 2 kids rather than 6, partly because both parents began working and partly because the kids were surviving. Feeding 6 of them is a lot of work. Population regulated itself, birth rate tapers off and becomes linear after the 60s, despite growth in the production of food and other resources outpacing human population. When there are more people, linear growth, having the same number of births as previous years, despite the existence of more people of childbearing age, means the birth rate actually went down. People having fewer kids. We don't call that the baby bust, though, do we? That might remind people of the boom-bust cycle that pervades society as long as capitalism's fundamental contradictions persist. But the thing is, people were noticing them anyways. The 1960s was rife with crises of imperial stage capitalism, from groups oppressed in the imperial core demanding civil rights to the imperial state waging an unpopular war in a newly formed communist state. The New Deal and the World War that powered it only averted a crisis and temporarily made things look shiny and new. But beneath the rot, the inequalities and perceived scarcity that created them caused a reaction. So there you go. There you go. That's just from the first chapter of Less Sucks, Overpopulation, Eugenics, and Degrowth by Peter Coffin. Go and check it out. It is a great, great book. It is a great, great book. There, putting back theories of surplus value. So, folks, we've been going for a little while here. We're going to keep going, keep the super chats rolling in. And anytime, Peter is a great friend of what we do. Peter is a member of the Center for Political Innovation. He's an awesome fellow, a great anti-imperialist, and I love working with Peter. I recommend his work. His videos are awesome. But folks, you know, we do have some super chats to get to. We do have the second half of the show. But before we go there, I'm going to do, before we get to the roll call, before we get to the thing, you know, the super chats and answering questions, before we get into all of that, I want to do something that I do on this show a lot. On these YouTube live streams, I do this a lot, but I do it because it's important. And that is that I quickly go over the basics. I remind us all why we are here. I remind us all of the basics of the worldview that has been so pivotal in human history. Because what we base ourselves on here on these live streams and on the Center for Political Innovation, the city building tendency, what we base ourselves on is the ideology that made Russia and China into superpowers, the ideology that raised millions of people out of poverty in Cuba and Venezuela and other countries in the world, that made Libya the highest life expectancy on the African continent. We base ourselves on the scientific understanding of Marxism, on the scientific socialism of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. That is the basis on which these streams are taken. And while we do stray from them, and while we take guidance and inspiration from the countries around the world that are building 21st century socialism, the basics are our foundation. The fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism are essential to what we do here. And we are living in an era where interest in socialism is rising. The weaknesses and failures of capitalism are apparent everywhere. The global system of imperialism is crashing and burning and coming apart. And it becomes even more important to be absolutely clear about what the answers are. Because right now they are bringing out every old canard, every diversion, every fake socialism, every path away from what is needed. They are bringing it back. All of the old delusions, from Proudhon to Lassalle to utopianism to degrowthism, they're bringing it all back. They are desperate to confuse us and to keep us off of the only path that has ultimately ever led to things getting better. And that is the path of scientific socialism. It's only through scientific socialism and through anti-imperialism that we have seen progress in the world. So I'm going to quickly remind people some of the basics that we just can't repeat enough. This is the critique of the Goethe program. What is this important work by Karl Marx, the critique of the Goethe program? Well, when the German Social Democratic Party was founded, they had their founding meeting in a place called Goethe. And they wrote their manifesto, the Goethe program. And Karl Marx read it, and he went, and he hit himself on the head, and he's like, they got it all wrong. So Karl Marx wrote a pamphlet critiquing the socialism of the Goethe program and correcting it in order to make it more scientific. And one of the things that he critiqued the Goethe program for was that the Goethe program was talking about redistributing income and redistributing the fruits of labor. Marx said, we're not interested in redistributing income. We're not interested in redistributing the fruits of labor. We're interested in changing the way the means of production function. We're interested in changing how the banks and the factories and the centers of economic power function. It is not about redistributing income. And he spends pages explaining we are not interested in redistributing wealth or income or the fruits of labor. We want to change the relations of production. And from there, he actually goes on a rant against this notion that socialism means we're going to make everybody equal. And this is what I've heard my whole life. Communism means they want to make everyone equal. No, wrong. Wrong. That is not what Marxism believes. Marxism does not want to make everyone equal. It wants rational control of the means of production so that economic growth can be overcome. And as Marx explains, he goes on a long rant about how there will be inequality in a socialist society. Some will be able to work harder than others. Some will have skills that others do not have. There will be inequality and unjust inequality in a socialist society. But this is what he writes, and this is so important. But these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it has just emerged from the prolonged birth pangs of capitalism. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. Let me repeat that. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. Meaning that the way society is set up is directly linked to how much wealth and abundance there is. The more wealth and abundance, the more equal a society can be, the more open a society can be. But that hierarchies are rooted in scarcity. And when there's not enough to go around, when people are poor, you're going to have a hierarchical system, and some will have and some will have not. But then he writes, in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribed from its banners, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. I have dealt more at length with the undiminished proceeds of labor on the one hand, and with equal right and fair distribution on the other, in order to show what a serious crime it is to attempt, on the one hand, to force our party, as dogmas, ideas, in which certain, and for a certain period had some meaning, to now become obsolete verbal rubbish, while again perverting it on the other, the realistic outlook, which it costs so much effort to instill into the party, but which has taken root by means of ideological nonsense about right. The prevailing distribution of the means of consumption is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. The latter distribution, however, is a feature of the mode of production itself. The capitalist mode of production, for example, rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers in the form of property and capital and land, while the masses are only owners of their personal condition of production of labor power. If the elements of production are so distributed, then the present-day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. If the material conditions of production are cooperative property of the workers themselves, then there likewise results a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one. Vulgar socialism has taken over for the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism is principally based on distribution. After the real relation has long been made clear, why retrogress again? Meaning socialism is not about the redistribution of wealth. This is the critique of the Goethe program by Karl Marx. Socialism is not about the redistribution of wealth. Socialism is about rational control and public ownership and public control over the means of production. It is when the banks and the factories and the centers of economic power are controlled by society and no longer governed by the chaos of the market, and are allowed to then produce unlimited wealth. And when the level of wealth in society goes up immensely, and income level increases, and people start to have more and more and more, at that point, when you have a society where labor has become life's prime want, not only a means of life, meaning people only have to work because they want to. No one has to work. People work because it's to entertain them. When the all-around productive forces have increased the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, when there's so much wealth created, when the subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it the antithesis between mental and physical labor, is vanished, when so much wealth has been created, when the cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed on its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Meaning the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world is only possible with vast abundance. It's only possible when a huge amount of wealth has been created. It's only possible when you get to the point where there's so much wealth in society that there's no need for anyone to hoard anything. When people only have to work because they feel like it, when there becomes no need for a state, right? That the hope of socialism, the entire point of socialism, is to unleash growth, like China has done. China used to be the sick man of Asia, but with socialism, they unleashed growth. They've lifted millions of people out of poverty, and they're marching toward this ideal of a world with so much wealth that inequality and the division of labor fades away. That is the goal. Socialism, the first phase, is a society not where we redistribute income, but rather where the means of production, the centers of economic power, are controlled by society. It is a society where the banks and the factories and the natural resources and the major industries are operated in the interest of society overall, in the interest of public good. It is when the means of production no longer function according to profit, but according to the interests of society overall. And you eliminate the anarchy of production, and growth is no longer held back by the irrational boom-bust cycle. That's what socialism is about. And at that point, growth is no longer restrained. And then that opens the door to moving toward that ultimate ideal of a society that is stateless and classless. This is scientific Marxism. And if you don't have scientific Marxism, if you think socialism is about dividing up everything equally, if you think socialism is about redistributing income, if you think socialism is about being jealous of the rich people because they have wealth and being mad that it's not fair they have money, that's not what it is. That is a caricature created by our enemies. If all they had done in the Soviet Union in 1917 was redistribute wealth that was already there, the Soviet Union would still be one of the poorest countries in the world. But it was because they took control of the means of production and had central planning that they were able to advance their living standards. If all Mao had ever done was redistribute wealth that was already there, China would still be deeply poor. And all of the anti-socialist, pro-free market canards are based on this lie that socialism is about the redistribution of income. It is not about the redistribution of income. And all of the attacks on socialist countries by idiots like Socialism Done Left, there's inequality in China, it's not socialist. There's inequality in socialism. Marx says so, everyone says so. If you're a scientific socialist, you realize there's going to have to be inequality in a socialist society. Oh, there's inequality in Cuba, it's not socialist. There's inequality in socialism. It's not about dividing everything up equally like you learned in school. And Margaret Thatcher, socialism only works for so long because pretty soon you run out of other people's money. No, you don't, because it's not about redistributing other people's money. It's about rational control of the means of production. This is what we have to understand. And the reason Peter's book is so important is because we are living in a period where the main way the imperialists are able to keep their system going is through destruction of the means of production. It's the only way they can keep their economy churning along, with war, with driving down the population, with forcible degrowth. That's the only way they can keep their system going. They are trying to make everyone have less. And they're starting to call it socialism. And that is not what socialism is. Socialism is about everyone having more. In fact, socialism is about having so much more that inequality fades away, that the need for a government fades away. Socialism is about creating a society with so much wealth and so much abundance that inequality and the need for a government itself can fade away, because right can never be higher than the conditions of society. That hierarchies and authoritarianism is rooted in scarcity, and abundance is the road to liberation. And Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran, they want to raise their people up out of poverty. They want more abundance. And the imperialists want false scarcity in order to keep their system churning along, because it's stuck in a long-term crisis of overproduction. This is what you need to understand about the economics of capitalism that we are living in. Capitalism in this period is gripped by degrowthism. And socialism is the way out of the long-term crisis of overproduction, and it is the way out of degrowth. It is the road to vast material abundance. And that's why we're socialists. I know there's a super chat on it, but why don't we just talk about it now before we get to the roll call? Again, they will look for any excuse to cancel me. They will. I mean, anything, right? I mean, but their latest hate Caleb campaign is based on the fact that I have called, and I continue to call, for an alliance, a united front between the labor movement, the industrial capitalists, and the anti-imperialist economies centered around Russia and China, right? And I stand by that. And they say, well, that's not Marxist because you're supporting capitalists. Every revolution in history has involved a united front. Every single one. The Bolsheviks in Russia entered an alliance with the peasantry, and they entered an alliance with the capitalists who wanted to bring down the Tsar, and they entered an alliance with the capitalists who wanted to end their involvement in World War I, and they entered an alliance with the German capitalists. Every revolution in history. On the Chinese flag, the stars stand for the peasantry, the workers, the middle class, and the intellectuals, and the national capitalists. And right now, the main danger to humanity is the big monopolies that are dominating the world and trying to hold back growth. The big four super major oil companies, the Silicon Valley elites, and the financiers, the bankers, they are the main danger right now. And ultimately, the road to socialism in America is dethroning them, putting oil and natural resources under public ownership, putting banking under public ownership, building up a popular state apparatus rooted in communities and neighborhoods and communities assemblies like Soviets or councils or like the Bolivarian circles, building up a popular mass movement that can take power in Washington, D.C., and kick the crap out of the oil companies, and kick the crap out of the Silicon Valley fascists, and kick the crap out of the bankers, and build up a state apparatus rooted among the population, and use that state apparatus to get the economy going again. And that would benefit many industrial capitalists. Many industrial capitalists who are not oil bankers, who are not Silicon Valley technicians, would benefit from that. And you could have a socialist economy where the state controlled the means of production, in which you had a layer of industrial capitalists. It is in their material interests to get along better with Russia and China, to have a strong labor movement so the income of the population goes up, and to see the big monopolies that are pushing degrowth removed from power. Right? This is the situation that we're living in. The imperialists, the big monopolies, are moving in to implement degrowth to try and stabilize their system. And this is the polarization that can lay the basis for the working people of America to become the ruling class, to have the working class, the broad masses of people, the population, take power. But in order to do it, they'll need to enter an alliance with the people around the world that are struggling against imperialism and with the capitalists of America that are locked out and also being degrown. The working class doesn't want to be degrown. It doesn't want its wages to go down. Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran and Cuba and the other countries around the world that are struggling to raise their people out of poverty, they don't want to be degrown. And the industrial capitalists also don't want to be degrown. However, the monopolists, the oil monopolies, the oil bankers, and the Silicon Valley fascists and the bankers, they want to degrow so that they can stay at the top of the pyramid. And when I talk about socialism, I'm talking about a government of action that fights for working families and stands up to the big oil companies and stands up to the Silicon Valley fascists and stands up to the bankers and beats them down while building the country up and subsidizes worker cooperatives and public works and businesses and stabilizes the economy and ensures growth and uses those oil profits to build schools and hospitals and to provide services for the population and hires the unemployed to go rebuild the country and build high-speed railway that pushes fusion energy so we can get off of fossil fuels. That is what we need. Socialism in America. That's what it would ultimately look like. It would be the defeat of the imperialists. And what you need to understand is that all the people who are busy canceling me over this, they are working for the imperialists. Their target is not the big oil companies. Their target is certainly not the Silicon Valley fascists. Their target is the industrial capitalists. They are angry at the lower level capitalists for not going along with the degrowth agenda. And they want to kick the lower level capitalists in line. And they're getting promoted on social media by the Silicon Valley fascists, by the tech monopolies to do that. And they're getting promoted and funded by the Ford Foundation and by the Rockefeller think tanks and by big oil. They're against nuclear power because nuclear power would put big oil out of business. They're against patriotic socialism because patriotic socialism would mean using the state to control the economy to build a better life for the Americans. And as far as they're concerned, what we need to do is transition the United States to a low-wage economy. So if you want to get your tweets to go viral, tweet against patriotic socialism and see how quickly the Silicon Valley fascists make your tweet blow up. Why? Why? Because they want to degrow America. And that's why they put 13 Reasons Why on Netflix to make your daughter commit suicide. And that's why they pumped opioids into this country and pushed doctors to overprescribe opioids. And that's why they have a culture of death while they're telling people that there is no truth. That's why. They want to degrow America. And Donald Trump, as bad as he is, represents an uprising of these industrial capitalist guys that don't give a flying fuck about the long-term interests of U.S. imperialism. They just want to see their profits go up. And they are not part of the club with the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Carnegies and the Bill Gateses and the Jeff Bezoses. And they're not going to see a benefit from this degrowth scheme. And they are under attack. And what those guys have to realize is that the real power in America comes from the working class. Look at the railroad workers, right? They could shut down the economy tomorrow if they go on strike. They could. That's power. And that ultimately the only hope for rebooting the economy and making these industrial capitalists making money is for them to enter an alliance with the working class at home, the labor movement, and with the anti-imperialist countries against the imperialists. That's what you have to understand. And the people who are attacking me right now are the imperialists. That's who they are. How did the Soviet government lose it? Okay, and the next one, Chinese leadership are actively pursuing exactly the kind of united front against imperialism we're talking. That's what you need to understand. And when I read Critique of the Goethe Program, and when I read Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific are actively pursuing, yeah, I got it. When I read Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Friedrich Engels, when I read Critique of the Goethe Program, when I read the Communist Manifesto, I am not reading a degrowth document. I am reading the opposite. I am reading a document that says the artificial restraints on growth can be lifted by rational control of the means of production. I'm reading, if you read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin, you are not reading a document that says, oh, all these poor people are rising out of poverty and that's bad for Mother Earth. No, we're reading a document about how imperialism is holding back growth, keeping these countries impoverished captive markets. That's what we're talking about. And this is scientific Marxism. Marx thought socialism would first come to Europe, but what he didn't foresee was Western capitalism developing into its monopoly stage of imperialism and dominating the planet and keeping countries across the planet impoverished. And he didn't foresee that in order that it would be in the East, and it was Lenin who understood that it would be in the colonized world that socialist revolutions would happen, because it would be the only way that deeply impoverished countries could raise themselves up, because Western capitalism would dominate the global markets. So only through a socialist revolution could China become a wealthy country. Only through a socialist revolution could Russia become a wealthy country. Only through a socialist revolution could countries like Cuba and Venezuela and in Iran and Libya break free. That's the only way they can do it. And that's the point. That's the point. And this is why the scientific socialist understanding is so important. And that's why you need to understand that they're rolling out every old canard about we're going to divide up wages equally. We're going to redistribute incomes. We're just going to build worker cooperatives that'll be voluntary. Socialism has nothing to do with the government. I think it does. You know, they're rolling out every old one of these stupid canards, every single one of them, because they don't want you to come to this conclusion. They want the socialist movement to be their little counter gang to kick around the lower level capitalists. And that is ultimately not going to help us, because at the end of the day, the only solution is for living standards to go up. The only solution is to fight for jobs and housing and schools and education and growth for the population. And the degrowth agenda that dominates capitalism right now, dominates imperialism. That's what we're fighting against. So there you go. I just wanted to be clear on that. And I get repetitive on these streams making this point, but it's very important. It's very, 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 very important. Very important. All right, so let's do the roll call, and now I'll start answering super chats. So names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you, names and locations. Don't worry, Peru is the first super chat. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. All right, Nate in Chicago. Very good. We got Rice from Adelaide, Australia, Randall in Lexington, Mr. Chopin, Kendall in San Diego. We got Bill from New Hampshire. We got Syria via Texas, Vaccine, St. Louis. Very, very, very good. Very, very good. Edwin from the Philippines, Boston, Massachusetts, Tomahawk, Tristan in Maryland. Shout out to you, Tristan. Ishmael from Los Angeles, Love Blind Hate in Binghamton, Jared in Ratliff, Chester in England, Patch in Arizona, John McCarthy in Chicago, Jay in Texas, Mosin from Iran, Alex from Brazil, Gabby in Chicago, Alexander C. in Russia, Cleveland Pirate Alex, Charles from New York, Jared from Virginia, Ryan in Oakland, Cleveland Pirate Alex, Balthazar in Oakland, Ryan in California, Neil Frazier out in Hong Kong. Very, 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 very good. Steve and Ann in Georgia, Dave Rennie in Hamilton, Ontario, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Redneck Red in West Virginia, Micah in Las Vegas, Good times, folks. Good times. Upper Peninsula, Viking Dave, Mako in North Carolina. Very good. Tristan in China. Welcome, Tristan. Good times, folks. Peter in Florida. Shout out to you, Peter. We were just reading from your book and we enjoyed it. That was great. Bob Troy in New York. Welcome, Bob Troy in New York. Who else is with us? Arnold and Joyce in Texas. Welcome, Arnold and Joyce. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome. I'm trying to do more of a diversity of times. Evenings, nights are the best times for me to do these streams, but I'm trying to do them at different times, give people a different chance to see it live. Because a lot of people watch this afterwards. They watch this the next day. They listen to it while they're taking a shower in the morning or driving to work. I know a lot of people listen to this while they drive to work if they have a commute, or or they listen to it, while they're exercising or something like that. So I want to do it at different times to give people an opportunity to be here live. So, that's how we do it. That's how we do it. All right. Well, now I'm going to start answering super chat questions. But if you have more super chat questions, we got Herb Bryant in Tampa, Florida. Shout out to you, Herb. If you've got more super chat questions, by all means, shoot them my way, because I'm always happy to answer your questions. First super chat, it says, knucklehead Trumpers are saying Paul Whelan versus Brittany Griner. Yeah, I saw that. And the problem with that, these Trumpers, they don't get it. They're like, oh, why would he free a basketball player who smoked weed instead of a U.S. Marine? Well, honestly, I'll just be clear. I think that it's actually better that Paul Whelan is still held and Brittany got free. Brittany Griner, brought drugs into the country, and, the USA plays hardball against Russians, so the Russians have got to play hardball back. But, Brittany Griner, drugs, right? Whereas Paul Whelan is a CIA guy. Paul Whelan's a guy who's tied in with the U.S. military. He's a guy who was engaged in spying against the Russian government, right? So, drugs are one thing, right? And I'm glad Brittany Griner got home. Russia had every right to arrest her. That was totally justified on their part. And, again, if the American government is going to be nasty and grab Vitkor Bout and, torture Maria Butina and all that, they have every right to play hardball back to Americans, right? And that's how these things tend to work, right? But at the same time, I'm glad that Brittany's free. I'm glad that she's back in the United States, But Paul Whelan, they have much more justification to grab him. He's a spy. The guy's a former U.S. military guy who was there spying, right? And these Trumpers, don't you get it? You guys are against the deep state. That's who Paul Whelan is. Paul Whelan is the deep state. That's what he is. He's the deep state, the American deep state in Russia. That's what he is. If you guys are against the deep state, right? These Trumpers are like, oh, we're against the deep state. Paul Whelan is the deep state. Somebody tweet that right now. Paul Whelan is the deep state, because he is, right? Brittany Griner, as far as I know, she could be working for the CIA for all I know. I don't know this kind of thing, but Brittany Griner is a basketball player. She brought drugs into the country. She shouldn't have done that, right? But Paul Whelan is a spy. Paul Whelan's a former U.S. military guy who was caught spying in Russia. So, if it was up to me, if I had to pick, if they said, well, and I'm not Russia, it's up to Russia ultimately. But if they asked me, Caleb, who would you rather see free? A basketball player who brought drugs into the country, or a spy working for U.S. imperialism trying to destabilize Russia? It'd be a no-brainer. I'd say release Brittany. Someone else says Kamala would have thrown her in jail for way longer. Exactly. But yeah, it's like, why are all these Trumpers like, why didn't they free Paul? He's a Marine. It's like, he's a spy. That's the deep state. Come on, guys. Seriously. All right. Please comment on Marxist theoretician Boris Kagarlitsky interview on Democracy Now! On how Russia lost and what comes after Putin. I have not seen this interview, so I can't comment. I'll have to go watch it, Mr. Chip. I have not seen it. I apologize, but I have not watched Boris Kagarlitsky. And, I have a feeling if Democracy Now! Is running it, they're so pro-imperialist at this point. But please discuss the situation in Syria, why Israel wants to decimate the Syrian population. That I can talk about. All righty. Yeah, you're absolutely right, John, that all these Trumpers sticking up for Paul Whelan, he's a spy. He's the American deep state. Brittany Griner is a basketball player, unless she's something else, which she very well could be, right? I mean, she could have been, for all we know. We don't know, right? We don't know, but she wasn't convicted of spying. She was convicted of drugs, right? They found drugs in her bag, right? So that's what she's been convicted of. So, that's what I'm tending to go with. But there you go. There you go. There you go. There you go. All righty. Next question. Yeah, Castillo. They not only did they drive him from office, they drug him to jail. It was a coup. Pedro Castillo. And, Pedro Castillo, I think at this point, he was a genuine anti-imperialist, but he entered an alliance with the synthetic left in order to take office. That the Biden administration made some kind of deal. All right. The only reason, guys, the only reason that they let him take office and they didn't immediately call him a dictator was some kind of deal was made. And that a lot of this left that's winning the elections in Latin America ain't revolutionary, right? This guy in Colombia, no. Right? This guy in Chile, no. But, Pedro Castillo, he's an anti-imperialist, but he entered an alliance with a lot of non-anti-imperialist folks. He made an alliance with kind of the mainstream left in order to take office. It was kind of a united front to beat the right wing, right? They Fujimori, she would have been more of a nationalist kind of, and they're, and the right wing in Latin America has made a lot of enemies, and it's complicated. And so he was able to get in. And he appointed a really awesome guy to be his foreign minister. And then they forced him to drop that guy. And then they replaced his foreign minister with a pro-imperialist person. And it sounds like Pedro Castillo, despite having entered an alliance with some of these pro-imperialist synthetic left, he was trying to be anti-imperialist. And so they ousted him. Right. And they accused him of all kinds of stuff. And he's not just out of office, he's in jail. Right. And it shows that they will stab you in the back. They will. Right. Look, the way you could tell that there was not a real threat to their power in Peru was the fact that they didn't immediately call him a dictator as soon as he took office, but they immediately went after his foreign minister and forced his foreign minister out. And, that's how these things work. And I mean, it's awful. It's a coup what just happened in Peru. And what's beyond me, is watching these people like Ben Norton and others go, "Oh my God, it's a coup. It's awful." It's like, hello. I mean, it's just like, it's like these people, I really don't get. I find it infuriating. The people that try to be woke and anti-imperialist at the same time. It's like, have they ever been on Twitter? Have they ever talked to a liberal before? Have they watched MSNBC before? Right? It's like this old dog. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, as they say. And it's like these people that still think somehow you can be a woke and also be anti-imperialist. It's like, no, you can't. Wokeism is the main doctrine. This is like being a woke and being pro-imperial and being anti-imperialist. It would be like the equivalent of being like in the German Communist Party. And then Hitler comes to power and he puts all the communists in concentration camps. And you're like, well, Hitler's a national socialist. So we kind of won, right? I mean, it was like one kind of socialist, right? And you're like, he's putting all the communists in concentration camps. He wants a war against the Soviet Union. They're like, yeah, but you don't get it. Like Hitler's a national socialist, so we kind of like we can have some common ground. It's like, no, he's gassing all the Jews. You cannot go along with it. No, but like, why do you have to be so negative, Caleb? I mean, it's like Hitler, like there's red on their flag. It's like, no, like they're our enemies. Like, these people don't get it. They really don't get it. They refuse to get it. And like, there was that Saturday Night Live sketch they did about a Trump rally. Let me see if I can find it, right? Why not? We love to like watch stuff on these streams. That's one thing we like to do. We're doing more of that now. Right? There's a Saturday Night Live Trump rally sketch that they did. Yeah, here it is, 3 years ago. This is exactly like the kind of stuff they showed on Venezuelan TV among the right wing against Chavez. It is exactly the kind of stuff. We'll show it right now. If you can't see that, yes, Trump is awful, okay, but I'm telling you that like their attack on Trump is coming from a more pro-imperialist place. And Norton and Abby Martin and all of them, they just cannot see that. It's like, well, I'm a leftist and I've been protesting and these people are using my favorite buzzwords, so they must be good. It's like, no. I mean, Ben Norton is the worst of them. He is the worst of them. The guy lives in Nicaragua, which is an amazing socialist country. So he's in Nicaragua, in an amazing socialist country that he recognizes is an amazing socialist country. So he's not like completely stupid. He does recognize that Nicaragua is an amazing socialist country. So living in Nicaragua, in an amazing socialist country, he tweets out that anyone who doesn't support abortion is a fascist and an enemy of the people. Anyone who doesn't support abortion, if you do not support abortion, if you are not for abortion, if you do not think abortion is good, if you don't want abortion 100% legal, if you're a Catholic or a Protestant or a Muslim, and you're a fascist, you're a fascist theocrat. He puts that. He's living in Nicaragua, a country with the strictest anti-abortion laws of any country in the world. Okay? So he's living in a country that is verbatim proof that his doctrine, his entire approach is wrong. The Sandinistas of Nicaragua are not the wokes of Nicaragua, you fucking idiot. The Sandinistas of Nicaraguans are supported by indigenous people, impoverished people, evangelical Christians, Pentecostals, working class people who want their living standards to go up, not degrowth, who hate the U.S. imperialists. Oh no, they're believing conspiracy theories, and are a lot of them deeply religious. And Ben Norton cannot get out of his mind that, well, no, the right wing are the bad ones and the wokes are the good ones. They're just sometimes pro-imperialist. They're just confused. No, they're not confused, Ben. They're not confused. And you're living in Nicaragua. If anyone who opposes abortion is a Nazi, that would make Nicaragua a Nazi country. Maybe culture wars are not what we should be focusing on. I mean, it's like, it's shocking to me that he can be that, that ridiculous. And then he's gone with the mainstream media, canceling anyone who questions anything that Big Pharma says. And that's why he he backstabbed Max Blumenthal, right? Because, oh my God, you can't have anyone criticizing Big Pharma. And it's just shocking, right? And it's like he's living in a country, Nicaragua, that is proof that wokeism is pro-imperialist. All the wokes in Nicaragua, all the gender studies majors, all the people that are getting their PhD, and are getting, money from a foundation to do research. All of them are anti-Ortega. And the people who are with Ortega are working class people. A lot of them have indigenous background, who are religious. Some of them are indigenous religions. Some of them are evangelicals and Pentecostals and religious folks. Working class people. I mean, it's like he doesn't get it. They don't have gay marriage in Nicaragua. I'm waiting for Ben Norton to tweet out, any country without gay marriage is a Nazi country. It's like, you're living in Nicaragua, you idiot. And he refuses to see that. I mean, it's utterly shocking to me. He hates the people. He hates the people. He hates the American people. And he doesn't get that it is the American working class. They're the ones that will bring socialism. And that is who the wokes hate. Wokeism is the voice of the middle class. The middle class has a lot of guilt and thinks that racism is a personal thing about good people and bad people. And they want to show everyone that they're a good person. They don't think that racism is rooted in capitalism and imperialism. They just think it's, that it's about good people and bad people and white privilege and guilt, right? And on top of that, they hate average working class people because they're not woke enough. In the FBI, if you can align yourself with that kind of trash, you're not a socialist. I mean, it's like, it's bad enough to rag on the people. It's bad enough to hate the working class. But if you hate the working class because they're questioning the mainstream media, if you hate the working class because they're not pro FBI and pro CIA enough, how can you call yourself a socialist? I mean, and that PSL, the pro, the pro woke pseudo anti-imperialist crowd that's not even doing a good job supporting Russia. They don't really support Russia when Russia's under all-out attack. They are a problem. They are a problem, and they need to be called out. That's what, you watch that sketch, it reminds me. I'll tell you, that sketch rung a bell for me when I saw it. It's 3 years old. But that sketch rung a bell for me because when I was in college, told this story before, there were a group of students from Brazil at my college. They were very, very white, very wealthy Brazilians, and they hated Lula da Silva. And I asked them one time, what do you think of Lula da Silva? And they said, oh, he's horrible. Lula da Silva, the socialist, he's awful. He's a dictator. He's horrible. And I said, wow. I said, why is he so bad? And they said, because he used to be a delivery man. He used to deliver boxes for a living. Oh, Brazil, we're a civilized nation. And now the leader of our country is a guy who used to deliver packages. It's humiliating. Oh, they think we're dirty working class people in Brazil. We're represented by this inferior man who carried boxes for a living. Oh my God. And I said, well, he keeps winning the elections. They said, of course he wins the elections. You know why he wins the elections? They said he wins the elections because of the fact that we have a law in Brazil that everyone has to vote. And I said, what? And they said, yeah, in Brazil, everybody has to vote. That means all those poor people and all the delivery box delivery men and all of them, they all get to vote, and they all get to vote, and they shouldn't vote. They're not smart enough. They're not elite and educated. They don't go to college. They don't study. They're not smart like we are. But all the poor people in Brazil, they all get to vote. They all have to vote. And so we get this guy. And I said, yeah, but why do they vote for Lula da Silva? And they said, because he gives them all jobs. Never forget, the girl was sitting in the hallway of the dorm. She was sitting on her laptop. Very, very light-skinned young Brazilian woman said, because he gives them all jobs. And that's what Ben Norton and all of them are going to be saying about Trump supporters. They're going to say, oh, the only reason Trump wins the election is all those inferior rabble from Michigan and Pennsylvania and Idaho and Montana. They get to vote. And why do they vote for Trump? Because he gives them all jobs. He just gives them all jobs. He should be shaming them for their white privilege. He should be telling them that they need to be poorer to save the environment. But no, he gives them jobs. It's the same attitude. This anti-Trump movement, the anti-MAGA stuff, is a defense of the CIA, a defense of U.S. imperialism, a defense of the establishment. And if you can't see that, if you can't wrap your mind around that, you have no business calling yourself a socialist, right? Socialism is not a defense of the establishment. It's not helping save their system with degrowth. Socialism is a revolutionary movement of the majority. Another quote from Marx, right? This is a very important quote, right? You cannot be a populist. You cannot be an anti-populist and be a Marxist. Right? You can't. Right? This is from the Communist Manifesto. This isn't an obscure quote from Marx. This is from the Communist Manifesto. And I'm going to put it in the chat because it's like a really important quote. Quote, all previous historical movements were movements of minorities, were in the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. Putting that in the chat because it's important. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. So if you are a socialist and you think populism is bad, you are not a socialist. If you think that socialism is somehow not in the interest of the immense majority, you are not a socialist. I mean, it's like it is very, very clear. Socialism comes from society. Communism comes from community. And this is a movement for the majority against the very, very, very wealthy minority. No, it's not a movement to protect the minority from the rabble and the inferior majority. No, it is a movement of the majority against the wealthy minority that exploits them. That's what it is. It's populism. And you know, I mean, William Z. Foster, Gus Hall, Huey Newton, none of these people were wokes. None of these people were anti-populists. None of these people loved the FBI. None of these people loved the CIA. None of these people thought that working people who questioned the FBI and CIA were idiots. Anyway, the assassination of Milk and Moscone. That is a strange, strange episode. You know, I'm going to do another stream at some point about how we're like in a weird, you know, they say that the generals are fighting the last war. Have you ever heard that expression? Generals fighting the last war. Like the beginning of the U.S. Civil War was like the Revolutionary War. And then the end of the U.S. Civil War was like World War I. They had trench warfare and machine guns. But for the first beginning of the American Civil War, they were kind of refighting the War of 1812 or the U.S. Civil War or the American Revolution. Right. And that it's an expression. Generals, they're always fighting the last war. They're always going over their head. What did they do wrong in the last war? And then they like reposition it. And the 1970s, the late 70s, we're talking 1978, 1979, 1980, there was a fight in the ruling class. And the fight was between the oil bankers and the Rockefeller Eastern establishment and the lower levels of capital in the military-industrial complex. And Reagan represented the lower levels of capital and the military-industrial complex. But in order to be allowed to do his thing, he had to bring Bush in as his vice president. And so he had to already compromise with the oil folks because Bush was an oil man from Connecticut and former CIA director. And then right after Reagan, you know, was like a far right industrialist, military industrial complex guy. But then right after Reagan took office, he was shot and Bush assumed the presidency briefly. And after that, it became clear that Reagan, you know, he could do his right-wing strongman thing a little bit, but he couldn't go too far with it. You know, but Reagan, the rise of Reagan to some degree or other represented a kind of an upsurge of the military industrial complex against the Rockefeller Eastern establishment, against the big oil bankers. And that was a fight that was going on. And Jimmy Carter, you know, he brought in almost everyone from Jimmy Carter's cabinet, came from the Trilateral Commission, which was a think tank that was set up by David Rockefeller and the Rockefellers. And they employed Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And they set up the Trilateral Commission and they wrecked the U.S. economy. Now, they put people in at the Federal Reserve who got rid of all the regulations around lending. It used to be that local states in the United States had what are called usury laws. And usury laws were laws that made it illegal to charge too much interest. The idea was that it was, you know, it was not moral. You know, they call it theft, right? I mean, if you lend somebody money, but you make them pay back like, you know, 200% interest or something, that's criminal. Right? That's just not moral. You're taking advantage of the fact that the person needs to be lended to, right? You know, there's that song by Woody Guthrie, I'm a jolly banker. So give me back 2 for the one I lend you, because I'm a jolly banker am I? Right? And local states around the country had laws that said you couldn't do that, right? You couldn't charge huge amounts of interest. Well, the U.S. Congress under Jimmy Carter passed a law and made state usury laws illegal, so that you couldn't regulate interest rates. You couldn't have usury laws. He did all kinds of things that wrecked the economy. He pushed the Malthusian degrowth stuff really, really hard. when there was an energy crisis, he got on TV and told Americans they should wear sweaters instead of turning up the heat if it costs too much. And he told Americans they should just be poorer, right? That owning things and having things isn't going to make you happy. I'm Jimmy Carter, and he was very much a degrowther, and he went after his own party, right? There was a faction in his own party. They called them the smokestack Democrats. And they were labor union guys. Most of them were Roman Catholic. They were Italian, mostly Italian and Irish guys. They were close to the Teamsters Union. They were pro-labor guys that were usually in urban areas, and they were pro-labor union. And they wouldn't go along with this. And they supported nuclear power, and they were trying to raise the living conditions. They called them smokestack Democrats, or, industrial Democrats. They were like old Roosevelt Democrats. And Jimmy Carter framed them all up with the FBI. They had ABSCAM, which stood for Arab scam. They hired an FBI guy to dress up like an Arab sheik and try to bribe him. And there was one case where there was some senator, they actually tried to bribe the guy, and he pushed the suitcase away and said, "No, I don't want this." And they still convicted him of bribery. And they just purged the Democratic Party of these pro-labor Democrats in order to pave the way for the degrowth stuff. But anyway, that was the backdrop. And this fight was waging among the bourgeoisie. And I actually gave a class at our retreat in Kansas at the Lynn Valley Training School. I gave a class on like the transition from Carter to Reagan and like all the things that were happening. So many things were happening. It was a very wild, wild moment. I made a timeline. It's like, holy shit, the amount of things that were going on. But one thing that happened was San Francisco. So San Francisco was a very important place in the political legacy of the 1960s. First thing first, San Francisco is where you had Ramparts magazine. You folks know about Ramparts magazine? Ramparts magazine was it started out as this like kind of liberal Roman Catholic magazine. But all of a sudden it turned into the New Left magazine. It was the magazine that promoted the Black Panthers. It was the magazine that promoted Maoism and communist China. And this magazine from the Bay Area, it was kind of an obscure magazine, Ramparts. It just went everywhere. And it was a magazine that, that really a lot of the big names of the New Left worked for Ramparts. No one would have ever heard of Eldridge Cleaver if it wasn't for Ramparts magazine. Eldridge Cleaver was this man who'd been convicted of rape. He was serving time in prison for rape, and he started writing letters to Ramparts magazine. And Ramparts magazine started publishing his letters about racism. And then Eldridge Cleaver came out of prison and became like a Black Panther, right? He was a convicted rapist who was in prison writing letters about racism, and Soul on Ice is the letters that were published in Ramparts magazine. Very odd. Ramparts magazine hired Bob Avakian, the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party, right? That was his job. That's how he started out. He was just employed by Ramparts magazine. On top of that, they hired David Horowitz, who's now an awful right-wing guy. He's a neocon. But David Horowitz, back then, he was a leftist. His parents were big Communist Party members, and he was the editor of Ramparts magazine. So it was very strange. It was this magazine that just kind of blew up, and it was one of the main publications. And people read Ramparts all over the country. And so Ramparts magazine, it was the New Left magazine, right? It like people read it in New York City. Like it was just this big, yeah, I'm getting to it. Hold your horses. So San Francisco was like ground zero for the New Left, the 1960s New Left. That's where the free speech movement happened at Berkeley. That's where the Black Panthers started in Oakland. So like San Francisco, which is, it's Northern California, major city in the United States. That's a dock port city. That was where the New Left, the 1960s political movement got going. So San Francisco is a very important city. As the 1970s went on, the New Left started to have political influence in San Francisco. And they elected two politicians to office who were Bernie Sanders-ish, I guess you could say. The first one was the mayor, George Moscone. George Moscone was like he's probably far to the left of any mayor of a major city we've had in recent years. I mean, he was a social democrat. I mean, he wasn't a communist, but he was a social democrat. And he was a friend of the labor unions. He was a kind of a populist, pro-labor. He was like a Dennis Kucinich kind of figure. He was a very far left mayor, George Moscone. And in addition to that, they elected the first openly gay elected official, Harvey Milk. And Harvey Milk was also a leftist. Back then, if you were openly gay, you were a leftist because most of America was against homosexuality. But he was left. All right, we went down. My internet went out briefly, but I'm back. So anyway, George Moscone and Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was, he was a gay rights activist, and he ran for city council on a platform of supporting labor unions. He got, San Francisco. First of all, why was San Francisco like the gay mecca during that time? Well, it actually started out during World War II. If you got kicked out of the U.S. military for being gay, they would drop you in San Francisco. And that was common during World War II. If they caught, then it was, the military, it's all men and men are together. And if they caught two guys being gay in the military, they would send them both to San Francisco and give them a dishonorable discharge. So San Francisco was where they would drop gay people. That continued during the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So because San Francisco, if you were fighting in Vietnam or fighting in the Pacific and you got caught being gay, they dropped you in San Francisco. The memo started going out that San Francisco was like the gay city, right? And still now San Francisco is very gay, but like San Francisco, because it was like, it was a major city on the East Coast, a lot of U.S. military stuff there, a lot of gay stuff. So San Francisco was like a kind of a gay place. New York City is on the East Coast. That's where all the gay people were back in the 70s. And in San Francisco, that's where all the gay people were on the West Coast. Right. Like the Village People, right? The Village People are the big gay disco group in the 70s, right? They're the YMCA and all of that. But they're the Village People for Greenwich Village in New York. And they have a song about San Francisco, right? And they even have another song about like, let's go west, go west. It was, there was Francisco for gay people on the West Coast and New York City was for gay people on the East Coast, right? So San Francisco was this, this very, very gay city and a lot of gay nightclubs and gay bars, etc. And so Harvey Milk, he got all the gay bars to boycott the beer. There's a beer that was non-union. Like I think it was Coors. It was one of these beers that was hiring non-union labor. And so there was a boycott that the unions were calling of this beer. And he got all the gay bars to boycott this beer that was non-union. So, that was kind of his rise in popularity. He was a pro-labor union gay activist. Okay. But what you have to remember is that both George Moscone, the liberal mayor of San Francisco, and Harvey Milk both got support from something called the People's Temple. Do people remember the People's Temple? That's Reverend Jim Jones. And the People's Temple was this religious cult that was in San Francisco. I don't want to use the word cult, right? The word cult has no meaning. It was this very, very authoritarian, hierarchical, cohesive, abusive religious organization in San Francisco. I'll put it that way. I don't want to use the word cult because that's a meaningless word. It was a very abusive, hierarchical, authoritarian religious organization in San Francisco, led by Reverend Jim Jones. And Reverend Jim Jones, he was calling himself a communist at that point. He claimed he was both a Christian Christian and a communist. He claimed he was the combined reincarnation of both Jesus and Lenin in one, sent to America to save the black people or something like that. And it started out in Indiana, and then they were in another part of California, and Jim Jones was living in San Francisco, and he was this big leftist, and he would bring his church to big anti-war protests, and he was just this well-known pastor in San Francisco. He was a white guy from Indiana, but his church was mostly black people. But he would recruit some white people into the church as well, but it was mainly black people. Like, he would recruit white leftists, but it was mainly black people, low-income black folks from Oakland and other places. And he was this big pastor who had a very, very authoritarian and notoriously abusive church. And so Jim Jones, he would suck up to politicians, right? That was his strategy. And so he sucked up to George Moscone, and he sucked up to Harvey Milk by having his religious church members do campaign work for the two of them for free. They campaigned for George Moscone for free. They campaigned for Harvey Milk for free. And all of Jim Jones' church members, which there were many of them, they would campaign for these, politicians for free. Right. And so with the free campaign labor of activists from the People's Temple and all of that, Harvey Milk and George Moscone got elected. Now, what happened was that after George Moscone was elected, let me add, Dianne Feinstein was also a politician in San Francisco during this time. She ran against George Moscone in the election, arguing that George Moscone was far left. She said he was a radical, he was a socialist, he was an extremist. She was a more sensible Democrat. She was like a centrist Democrat. She ran against George Moscone, and she lost the election, right? Dianne Feinstein lost the election to George Moscone, the far left candidate. And so George Moscone was the mayor. Harvey Milk was the first openly gay elected official. And so then, because it was pretty clear that, another thing, George Moscone appointed Jim Jones to be the housing director of San Francisco, the guy who was in charge of public housing. So Jim Jones is not only this pastor who thinks he's the reincarnation of both Jesus and Lenin combined and is sent to earth to save the black people or whatever. Now Jim Jones is also claiming that he's got a title. He's like a government official. He's the head of the housing bureau, right? He's the head of the public housing of San Francisco. So at that point, because of the fact that George Moscone was a liberal and was pretty far left, and Harvey Milk was pretty far left, and that they had appointed Jim Jones, the head of the Public Housing Bureau, Republicans and moderate Democrats started digging up dirt on Jim Jones. And there's plenty of dirt on Jim Jones, right? The guy was not a good dude, right? And I'm not going to get into detail about it, but Jim Jones was not a good dude, okay? One of the beliefs of Jim Jones' church was that everyone was homosexual deep down. And so, like, he would have sex with men in the church, like, help them realize they were homosexual. Right. And he also believed that women were all homosexual deep down. So he would have sex with them to help them realize that, to help them overcome their homosexuality. A lot of wild things were going on in the People's Temple. It was a really unhealthy organization, a lot of abuse, a lot of unhealthy things were going on. And, and that happens. I mean, there's abuse in organizations. There's unethical practices. So Jim Jones was notoriously unethical. And so, because he was starting to have a lot of power in San Francisco politics, and he'd aligned with George Moscone and he'd aligned with Harvey Milk, Jim Jones was, being exposed in the media for his unethical practices. And so Jim Jones took his followers to Guyana. And then we know what happened in Guyana. A member of Congress went down to Guyana to visit it, and they killed a member of Congress, or somebody killed them, and then there was the mass suicide. So 1978, you had the mass suicide in Guyana, right? Very famous incident where all of Jim Jones' cult members, they all drank cyanide, and some of them were shot, and it was a horrendous incident. So what a lot of people don't realize is that it was just 2 weeks after the Jonestown mass suicide, just 2 weeks later, that George Moscone and Harvey Milk were assassinated. And that chain of events makes their assassination very interesting, right? Because if you think about it, the guy who got them elected, there's a mass suicide that's shocking the world in Guyana. And then 2 weeks later, they get killed. They were shot in City Hall by a former police officer who snuck in through a window and killed them. And then he only got like a 2-year, 3-year prison sentence because of the Twinkie defense. He said the junk food made him do it, right? He was mentally ill and junk food made him very mysterious. And then who got to be the mayor after Dan White? Yeah, it was Dan White. After Dan White killed George Moscone and Harvey Milk, who became the mayor of San Francisco? Dianne Feinstein. So yeah, it's pretty shady. You look at the details there, that is extremely shady. Extremely shady. That is extremely bizarre. Something not right is going on there, and we don't know what exactly, right? I mean, people talk about MK Ultra and Jim Jones, but to be fair, Jim Jones also had a relationship with the Soviet Union. I mean, that was pretty clear. I mean, he was very much in with the Soviet Union, and Angela Davis was very friendly with Jim Jones. If you want to piss off Angela Davis, somebody's got to interview Angela Davis someday and ask her about what Jim Jones was like. See what she says. I would love to hear that, because Angela Davis went over to Jim Jones' apartment. She spoke that Jonestown, they would play her over the big loudspeakers at Jonestown. Angela Davis and Jim Jones were buddies. No one ever talks about that, right? That's one way, you know, I'd love to interview Angela Davis sometime and ask her about that, because see what her reaction would be. Because, you know, I mean, I feel like she would rip the mic off and walk right out of the room probably. But, you know, Angela Davis and Jim Jones were hanging out. They were good friends or something. Pretty wacky, pretty weird. But you'll never hear any of the people. Now they all love Angela Davis. They all love Angela Davis. And I will say this, right? Angela Davis, to her credit, right? You have to give her credit, right? For the fact that she was the main spokesperson for the Communist Party during the 70s and 80s. Gus Hall was pretty old during those days. She was the main spokesperson. And she defended East Germany. She defended the Soviet Union. She defended Cuba. And she was on trial for her life. However, people asked questions about her ties to the Frankfurt School. I mean, she got her education. All of her academic work started out with the CIA, with the Frankfurt School. That's a little weird, right? So what was going on there? Like, all of her academic work is tied to a CIA-linked false Marxism called the Frankfurt School, right? Herbert Marcuse and all of that was being funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and that's where she got her education. That's pretty weird. And she quit the Communist Party as soon as the Soviet Union fell. She betrayed the Communist Party. She was one of the biggest supporters of Gorbachev, and she stabbed Gus Hall in the back, and she split the Communist Party. So, she did good work pretty clearly, right? During her youth. I mean, during her time leading the Communist Party. And even now, she will defend the Soviet Union in speeches. She will defend East Germany. But at the time the Soviet Union was being dismantled, she was supporting the people who dismantled it. She has roots with the Frankfurt School and with the CIA. So there's questions there. And now she's awoke. One thing that infuriates me is when, like, I was tweeting at Vosh about, if he said all tankies are Nazis, I said, what about Angela Davis? And I had all these idiots tweeting at me, Angela Davis is an anarchist, you idiot. Angela Davis would never support the Soviet Union. Oh my God, you must be retarded to think Angela Davis was a tanky. Angela Davis was definitely a tanky. She supported North Korea. She supported Cuba. She supported all those countries. In the 70s and 80s, she was on Soviet television very frequently. She was on, she was the main public spokesperson for the Communist Party USA, and she held the line. She gave their line, So, people, so now she's awoke, right? Interesting. I want to read that, John. I want to read that. I didn't know about that. That sounds like something I should read on this stream. If you can find me the text of that, John, I think about reading that on this stream. I got to read it first, but that's fascinating. I did not know that about Maria Butina. Maria Butina wrote a letter to Angela Davis. Oh, shit. But anyway, that whole thing, if you look at the chain of events, Jonestown mass suicide, assassination of George Moscone, assassination of Harvey Milk, Dianne Feinstein becomes mayor. And the guy who then killed them gets acquitted. All of that is really weird. And that San Francisco, look, there was a lot of deep state stuff going on in San Francisco in the 70s. That is just a fact. And I'm not saying who was working for who, but there was a huge amount of deep state operations going on, right? And that, that there was, it's pretty clear that, that the CIA and the liberal CIA tends to be based in California, right? The Stanford Research Institute, Marilyn Ferguson, and Silicon Valley. That's the liberal CIA. California is their territory, right? In Marilyn Ferguson's screed, The Aquarian Conspiracy, she said, America is free, but California is freer. Like that. I mean, California is very, very much, that is the liberal CIA's territory. But that said, it's also pretty clear, San Francisco was the center of the Maoist movement, right? I mean, that's where the Maoists were. The October League, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, the Communist Party USA, Marxist-Leninist. San Francisco, for some reason, California was all about Maoists. There were Maoists like crazy out there, and the Black Panthers were out there. There's speculation about influence of Chinese intelligence. That the FBI was convinced that the Chinese government was funding people in San Francisco, that, and that there's a big Chinese American community in San Francisco. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, if you read the FBI files from that period, which are public, you can read them, COINTELPRO documents, they are convinced, if you read it, that they're convinced that the Chinese intelligence agencies are walking around and funding everything. And for all we know, they might have been. I don't know. I mean, it's possible. I mean, Gaddafi gave support to the Black Panthers and stuff. So is it possible that, that China had some influence in San Francisco, had a foothold or something? It's possible, right? We don't know. But, I mean, it appears, that the FBI believed that Chinese intelligence was operating very heavily in San Francisco. It's also believed, there was also some deep state versus deep state stuff going on, because California, you have to remember, California, who was the governor of San Francisco for most of the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, was Ronald Reagan, right? And Nixon was from California. Right. So there was, like, on the one hand, San Francisco, this hotbed of the synthetic left and the liberal CIA and Congress for Cultural Freedom and MK Ultra. I mean, Haight-Ashbury is where the CIA is distributing the LSD. All the LSD experiments, MK Ultra, Operation Chaos, that's all happening in San Francisco. Meanwhile, the governor is Ronald Reagan, who's a hardline conservative. Richard Nixon is from California. There was deep state stuff going on, right? And we don't really know to what extent what was going on. How much was Jim Jones MK Ultra? How much was he in with the Soviets? How much was, and then, also there was some counter ganging stuff going on, right? And this is one thing that I've heard about, right? Is that in San Francisco, it was pretty clear the mainstream left was being supported by the CIA. That's documented, right? That the LSD was being distributed by the CIA, that, the Congress for Cultural Freedom and Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, the mainstream left was being supported by the CIA. But a lot of counter gang groups at that time. There were a lot of Trotskyist groups. Again, I'm so obsessed with history. I would sit these old communists down and just talk to them and learn from them. And people told me about how during the 1970s, in San Francisco, you would have a communist meeting. There'd be a communist event about stopping the war in Vietnam or whatever. And like crazy Trotskyites with masks and baseball bats would come and beat you up and like smash up the meeting for being a Stalinist meeting. And like these communist groups were fighting with each other. It was like FBI versus FBI. I mean, it was like there was a lot of like weird deep state stuff going on, right? Where like, one communist group would have a meeting about stopping the war in Vietnam, and another communist group would show up with chains and baseball bats and weapons, and they would charge it on the grounds that it was like a fake communist group. That kind of thing happened, right? And at that point, it's pretty clear that like there's one intelligence agency that thinks that, that this meeting is run by some other intelligence agency. There's deep state stuff like that going on, right? And that there were a lot of very small communist groups operating in San Francisco that were very violent, right? That's where the Symbionese Liberation Army was. The SLA, do folks remember the SLA that kidnapped Patty Hearst? They were in San Francisco. That's where they started, right? It was like 5 people led by Don DeFries. And they, and that there was a huge amount of like radical organizations, people calling themselves communists or anarchists or Marxists with guns, with weapons, kidnapping people. There were assassinations, there were bombings, and leftist groups were fighting other leftist groups. There was a lot of chaos going on. And you had Jim Jones doing his thing. And amid all of that, you had George Moscone and Harvey Milk. And then you had, Jonestown and then the assassinations. And, it's funny because it's like, I'm talking about this now, right? About like, well, communist groups violently attacking other communist groups and all of this. It reminds me of 2 things. First thing it reminds me of is the years of lead, right? In Italy, they talk about the years of lead. And that's when it seemed like Italy was going to vote for the Communist Party. In the 60s, it seemed pretty clear that Italy was moving into electing a communist government. And so to mess things up, the CIA created chaos in Italy, and they started giving guns and weapons to fascists to assassinate communists. And they also started giving guns and weapons to Maoists and Trotskyites and ultra-leftists to engage in terrorist violence, to like discredit leftists and cause chaos. And in Italy, in the 1960s and 70s, Italy was in complete chaos because there were a bunch of extremist groups and weapons and all kinds of stuff. They call it the years of lead, Operation Gladio, right? It was a lot of confusion, right? Writing it down. Writing it down. So there was a lot of confusion going on. And that the intelligence agencies, the deep state, they were fighting with each other, right? That military industrial complex, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon wing of the deep state was fighting against the Eastern establishment. Silicon Valley was starting to get set up in the late 70s. The computer revolution was just getting going, right? And I've talked to people who lived there. There was a woman that I knew that I worked with politically, I won't say where, who had been in San Francisco during these years. And she'd been in one of the Maoist groups. She'd been in a Maoist feminist group. And she told me she remembered when People's Temple would participate in the big parades. They had big parades, like big anti-war demonstrations. And she said she remembered People's Temple because People's Temple would march. And she said what she remembered was they would have traditional African drums and crowds of white and black people like dancing together. And people just knew them as some church. And they would march in all the parades. They were just some church that was anti-war, that was mixed race. And they would have African drummers and people of both races, black and white, dancing to the African drummers. That's what people knew People's Temple to be. And she said, when we heard what became of it, that was utterly terrifying because we just knew them as some church, which is interesting. The other thing is that I'm trying to remember. I mean, the Bay Area. I mean, all kinds of stuff was going on. There was a communist group called the Democratic Workers Party, which was like a Maoist feminist group that operated in San Francisco. And was very big, and there's a whole story there. You can read about Marlene Dixon and the Democratic Workers Party and what was going on there. The Black Panthers were in the Bay Area. That's where they started, in Oakland. There was all kinds of stuff going on, and it was a lot of confusion. It reminds me of the years of lead in Italy, except there wasn't as much death, right? There wasn't as much killing. I mean, maybe if you include Jonestown, but for the most part, there wasn't as much, straight up killing. A lot of violence between these communist groups beating each other up with chains and baseball bats, shooting at each other. And on top of that, it reminds me of now, right? With the Proud Boys, with Antifa. We all know this is FBI versus FBI, right? This is deep state versus deep state. This is CIA versus CIA. It's now proven that Enrique Taro was an FBI informant, the head of the Proud Boys. He was like an FBI informant, and that the deep state has embedded itself in the Proud Boys. You can bet the deep state has embedded itself in Antifa, and that they're not just embedding themselves to get information and stuff. They use these groups. There are deep state agendas, right? And that especially when groups are very violent, this is Sorelianism, right? The goal of a communist group is to put forward a program and mobilize the broad masses of people to advance the interests of the working class. But George Sorel said, no, we have to have very isolated groups that engage in acts of violence, right? And that's what counter gangs are. They're Sorelian formations. They're very isolated groups. Their beliefs are very, very, very extreme, very, very extreme, right? They only accept people that will, give the whole of their lives and completely obey and not have a mind of their own. And they're used not to mobilize the broad masses of people, but rather to carry out operations, right? And that's Sorelian counter gangs, right? And that if you look at the way a lot of these groups in the 70s operated, they weren't trying to appeal to the broad masses of people. They were trying to build some kind of Sorelian formation that would engage in violent operations that would somehow advance some kind of deep state agenda. And that's why I have so much admiration for what was called the new communist movement. The Maoist groups, for the most part, the October League, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Workers' Party, they actually tried to reach the broad masses of people. They did. If you read Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum, if you read Heavy Radicals or Threat of Greatest Magnitude by Aaron Leonard, you can see that the Maoist groups, that broke with the Weathermen, that came out of Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, the October League, the Communist Workers' Party, the Communist Labor Party of Nelson Peary, those groups, they actually were trying to get to the masses. They were repudiating the hippie movement. They didn't use drugs. They had short hair in a lot of cases, and they were trying to get to the masses. They got jobs in factories. They were trying to do what you're supposed to do, and they realized that the hippie movement was not good. They realized that that the socialist countries of the world were not in line with the hippie counterculture, and they were trying to build something like what CPUSA had been in the 30s. They were not successful because the U.S. economy was still so strong, but they had good instincts. And so I encourage people to go read the old documents of those organizations. Read the Red Papers, the founding documents of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Go read the Red Papers. Go read stuff by the October League and all that, because you'll see a group of people that are trying to do the right thing. They know what the right thing is. They're just doing it in hostile territory, right? And I talk about the Boston trap and other things, and that, we need to study the new communist movement of the 70s. Is worth studying. It's very tragic. It's a great defeat. It's defeat after defeat. It's a demoralizing time. But that time period, the new communist movement from like 1969 to about 1982, 83, 84, that was a period where there was a significant block of people, tens of thousands of people, who were trying to be serious communist organizers in America. And they were giving it their all, and they were organizing, and they were trying to reach the broad masses. They weren't trying to do the hippie thing. They were doing out of the movement to the masses. They didn't call it that, but they got out of the movement, out of the hippie movement, and were trying to get to the masses. So there's a lot we can learn from that period. But yeah, the whole that moment, in a lot of ways, the Carter presidency was like a weird truth and reconciliation moment for the 60s. Right? Jimmy Carter pardoned all the draft dodgers, not draft resistors, right? If you were somebody who refused to fight in Vietnam and went to jail, he didn't pardon you. He only pardoned people who had fled to Canada. And he made a deal that if you had fled to Canada, you would come back to the United States. He pardoned draft dodgers, people who went to Canada, not draft resistors, right? And Jimmy Carter did the Church Committee that investigated and revealed the crimes of the FBI and CIA. The Church Committee, the Congressional Church Committee, was just revealing COINTELPRO, revealing MK Ultra. Got into the public record because of the Carter administration. And it was very much the Carter administration was trying to kind of heal the wounds of the 1960s, right? Jimmy Carter met with gay rights activists. He was the first president to meet with the gay rights activists. He sponsored a feminist conference, spent millions of dollars to sponsor this big conference about feminism, to set a women's agenda in Texas. Jimmy Carter was very much he was a new left president. And while he was doing all these kind of woke things, he was also waging a war against the labor movement in his own party and pushing degrowth really hard. The White House issued the Global 2000 report, arguing there are just too many people in the world. So it was a weird period. And then towards the end of the Carter presidency, you had the Iranian Revolution, you had the U.S. economy in shambles and like a nightmare. And then you had this kind of revolt by the military industrial complex, and a lot of weird things were happening in that period. That's the period where David Duke comes out of too. David Duke, right? He's the big Ku Klux Klan white supremacist guy. He came out of the woodwork in the late 70s, and suddenly he was on national television talking about being a Ku Klux Klansman, and they were having him on Donahue, and he was going around the country. You watch Black Klansman, the Spike Lee movie. It takes place during this period when David Duke, out of nowhere, the government, it's pretty clear the government to some degree or other, the FBI and the government was working with David Duke to try and build the Ku Klux Klan as kind of a counter gang. 1979, the Ku Klux Klan assassinated 5 members of the Communist Workers' Party on television, on live TV. It shot them, right? And David Duke was kind of rebuilding the Ku Klux Klan to be this like underground group that was like doing volunteer work for the FBI, cooperating with the COINTELPRO program, and weird stuff was going on. So it was a very strange period. A lot of deep state stuff was happening, I guess. And I could ramble about that all day, but there you go. All right. We got a lot more questions to get to. All right. Okay. The differences between Glenn Beck, Hannity, O'Reilly, and Limbaugh. Well, Glenn Beck is the most different of all of them. Rush Limbaugh, he was around a lot longer. He goes back to the 1980s. He comes out of like the Reagan years, and he was this heavy set guy. He's from Missouri, right? My dad's family is from Missouri. There's people, beloved members of our community are from Missouri. There's a part of southern Missouri they call Little Dixie. It's like near Arkansas, Ozark Mountains. That's where Rush Limbaugh is from. Rush Limbaugh is kind of a heavy-set guy, and he talks like this. I'm Rush Limbaugh. I don't like the liberals. I don't like liberals. They're just not good people. They don't like the country. They're communists. They're traitors to America. And he just kind of emerged, to you, Tyler. Said with love from Missouri. He was this like radio host who was notoriously rude, right? And that, Rush Limbaugh kind of appealed to people because there's a lot of people who, they have resentment, right? They have resentment, but they don't have like the bravery to be that rude. This is kind of the charm of Trump, is it's like they kind of wish they could be that rude. And Rush Limbaugh was blatantly rude. He was just a rude guy. And he did stuff that was pretty awful. I mean, one of the things he would do is he would read the names of people who died from AIDS with applause tracks playing, like he was happy they were dead. That's pretty hateful and nasty. That's a pretty awful, bigoted, nasty, hateful thing to do. But like he would do stuff like that. All right. He was a shock jock. He started out like on music radio, but between music radio, he would make offensive statements about gay people and about feminists and stuff like that. And he was this kind of chubby, overweight guy who would make mean, nasty comments, right? That was Rush Limbaugh, right? So there you go. In addition to that, right, you had, so that's Limbaugh, and he's been around since forever, right? He was around a really long time. Throughout the 90s, he was doing his thing. He had a television program for a while where he insulted Chelsea. He compared her to a dog. Do you remember that? And he was mean. He was just a mean guy that a lot of people that didn't have the courage to be that mean, they would hear him and they would appreciate his meanness. And he was good at kind of ridiculing, like I talked about before, ridiculing the self-importance of liberals, the moral high horse, the sense of superiority you get from liberals. That was his strength. He was very good at lampooning that. And one thing I've often talked about Rush Limbaugh that I think is hilarious, if you watch some of his stuff from the late 80s, it really doesn't age well. Oh boy, it really doesn't age well. Whenever he's talking about, one of his recurring themes was about Gorbachev. The liberals, they love Gorbachev. Why do they love Gorbachev? He's no different than any other Soviet dictator. But these liberals, they think there's something special about Gorbachev. Why do they like Gorbachev so much? Because he's a commie. Because he's a communist. There's no reason to like Gorbachev more than any other Soviet dictator. Why do we like liberals? Why do we like Gorbachev? Well, there's a reason that the liberals liked Gorbachev. There's a reason, Rush, that liberals like Gorbachev. Anyone who hates communists should love Gorbachev. But doesn't age well, right? Because he's not like doing deep analysis. He's just preaching the Democrats are a bunch of communists and traitors. That's why they love Gorbachev. I'm throwing the Vosh laugh in there for some reason. I mean, that didn't age well. Another thing that didn't age well is that he hated Nelson Mandela. Rush Limbaugh could not stand Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela's a communist. He's a communist. And he would rant against Nelson Mandela as if Nelson Mandela were Che Guevara or something. That also doesn't age well because now the liberal left, eulogizes Mandela and covers up that he was a communist. That's Rush Limbaugh, the mean shock jock. He was good at tearing down the kind of sense of superiority that liberals had. And I will say one thing that Rush Limbaugh has in common with all of these people is that he doesn't play by the rules. He didn't play by the rules, right? Most mainstream media, they kind of play by the rules. They're talking to the American government. They're talking to people in the State Department, and they play by the rules. Rush was an entertainer, and he hit below the belt, and he didn't play by the rules. And so because he didn't play by the rules, he could do stuff that was more entertaining, right? His humor often crossed the line. It was biting, and he didn't play by the rules. And right after Barack Obama got elected, I will never forget this. It was hilarious. Rush Limbaugh got on this kick that Barack Obama was bad, and so he was supporting whoever Obama was fighting against. So when Obama sent soldiers to Africa to fight the Lord's Resistance Army, Rush Limbaugh was on there saying, Obama just sent troops to Africa to fight a group of Christians. They're Christians, and he's fighting the Christians. And he started reading the manifesto of the Lord's Resistance Army on the radio. Like he was supporting the Lord's Resistance Army, this like Christian group in Africa, this armed Christian like militia group that's called terrorists. Like he was supporting them because Obama's fighting them. It was like that's why he didn't play by the rules. He was just doing right-wing entertainment. And that's why Fox was hated, right? Is that Fox and conservative media in general, people call it conservatainment. It doesn't play by the rules. And that's why the establishment kind of always hated it. To some degree or other, there was an element of hating it. Even during the neocon years, when they were just putting out the pure establishment line, they were still hated because they didn't play by the rules. Rupert Murdoch at Fox, he just wanted to make money. He didn't give a flying, he didn't care. Right? He just wanted to make money. And that's why they always kind of didn't trust Fox News. They always didn't trust them. But anyway, Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity are completely different, right? So they didn't come into prominence until like the first decades of the 21st century. We're talking like 2000, 2001. Bill O'Reilly had been this like liberal news reporter for like Inside Edition. He had been like a TV personality who'd been like a liberal. And he had been like, he was a liberal, and he had been on Inside Edition, and he'd done reporting for different networks. And I think he got fired or something. And then he wrote some novels, and he was just this guy who'd been around like mainstream media for a while, but he was a liberal. Like he wasn't a leftist. He wasn't, he wasn't a right winger, and he wasn't a socialist. He was just kind of a liberal. Right. And he did this show that was kind of like Hard Copy. It was one of these like news magazine shows that was considered a little trashy. They did like, what do you call it? They did, like celebrity gossip, stuff like that. And he was just this guy who was on Inside Edition, right? And, he's an Irish guy, right? People remember that famous clip. We'll do it live. We'll do it live. Well, he's an Irish guy, right? I'm an Irish guy. Irish guys, we got a temper, right? He's got a temper. He's an Irish guy. He's got a temper. But Bill O'Reilly, he was just this guy, and then he was off of television for a while, and he wrote like some novels, and then anyway, he ended up at Fox. And at Fox, he and Sean Hannity, I'll put them in the same category. Both of them are Irish, right? Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity. They're Irish, and they're from that like Irish cop and fireman urban Irish thing. See, I'm Irish. I'm Irish by heritage on both sides, right? I have a French last name because my ancestry, I'm Protestant. I've always been Protestant. There's like no Catholics in my family, right? And a lot of Irish Protestants have French last names, right? They have They have French last names because the Huguenots, right? The French Protestants were expelled from France before the Revolution. They moved to Northern Ireland. The English were using them to kick around the Catholics. And so a lot of, Irish Protestants have French last names. But like my family's been here since before the American Revolution on both sides. And on top of that, my family were rural folks. They were not urban, right? And they're not urban cops and firemen. And actually, on my mother's side of the family, they did not believe in drinking alcohol. They were very, 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 very religious. I'm descended from Charles G. Finney, the founder of the Second Great Awakening. Was a pastor. A very religious. And that my family background are Irish Protestants, and they didn't believe in drinking, and they were deeply religious, and they lived in the countryside. So this, even though my heritage goes back to Ireland, I'm a redhead, I've got a temper or whatever, but my ancestry, the demographic of U.S. society that I come from is not the same as, when I go into an Irish pub in New York City, right? A lot of redheads. You see a lot of cops, you see a lot of firemen, you see a lot of city officials, you see very big, muscular kind of people, which I am not. I try to work out, but I'm not ripped. You know what I mean? A lot of big, ripped guys who are cops and firemen, and they are Roman Catholic, and they love to drink, they love alcohol, and that is not me, right? And those guys tend to be conservative because they're cops and firemen, and they're in like the enforcement wing of American politics. People talk about the history of why that is. The reason for that is because they talk about how when Irish people first came to the United States, they were considered to be, especially Irish Catholics, they were not considered equal citizens. Being a Catholic was like not respected. And so because of that, instead of being landowners and being WASPs, like old New England money, they got to be, cops. They got to be slave catchers. They called the slave catchers the paddy rollers. You ever heard that expression? The paddy rollers? Those were like the slave catchers. Well, they were Irish, right? The Irish, they can't be rich enough to own a plantation and own any slaves, but they can be the paddy rollers. They can chase after the slaves, right? It was the Irish were the enforcement wing. They were the hired cops, and a lot of them were big and strong and tough guys who liked to drink, and so they could enforce. They could be the enforcers of the order, right? They weren't the ruling class and the owners. They were the enforcers, right? That's where this comes from, right? Right. So that's Sean Hannity and that's Bill O'Reilly, right? Bill O'Reilly grew up in a huge amount of wealth, right? And I don't know Sean Hannity's background, but they're Irish urban cops, basically, more or less. That's what they are. They're Irish urban cops, and they play up this kind of working class aesthetic, right? Bill O'Reilly really worked hard on playing up this working class, thing. Like, I'm an average Joe. I'm just like you. And Bill O'Reilly's whole thing was that, like, he shared the concerns that average people might have that are very, somewhat socially conservative, right? He was worried about, gay pride parades being near schools, and he was worried about, pornography, and, it was kind of a social conservatism. And also this feeling that liberals were these elites, right? And that liberals, they think they know more than you, and they don't respect, it was very much playing up that, building on the Rush Limbaugh thing. But I will say Rush Limbaugh was just mean, right? Rush Limbaugh is on there just, yelling at liberals, and I'm going to play applause while gay people who died and AIDS victims who died names. Rush Limbaugh is just mean. With Sean Hannity, one thing about him is he has like a twinkle in his eye while he's doing it the whole time. Sean Hannity, you can kind of see that, he believes what he's saying and all that, but he's kind of a good-natured guy, right? As much as I don't agree with what he's saying, he means well, right? Bill O'Reilly, on the other hand, he seemed pretty sensible until anyone disagrees with him. And he's got a very, very shallow ego. And anyone disagreeing with him just gets under his skin, and he starts yelling. He's a narcissist. He was a narcissist. And if anyone dared disagree with him, he just got very defensive. How dare you say that? And that he would like fly off a handle if anyone was like making a good point or anything. Sean Hannity is just, Sean Hannity does the whole mean working class thing, but he's not in it really. Like, he's got kind of a twinkle in his eye, and he's just he's doing his thing. That's his job, is to be a conservative commentator. And, I think Sean Hannity is probably somebody that if we didn't talk about politics, I could probably be friendly with Sean Hannity, right? Bill O'Reilly, on the other hand, there's a huge ego there. There's like a huge narcissistic ego that if anyone, he seems pretty sensible, but if anyone disagrees with him, it's just like, how dare you disagree with me? And he flies off the handle, right? And I've seen that before, right? And that the big clips of Bill O'Reilly having these meltdowns, we'll do it live, fuck it, we'll do it live. Or, they're all of those clips are Bill O'Reilly. That's Bill O'Reilly, like someone's challenged him, right? And that's his fear, right? Is that he fears of being made a fool of. He fears someone making him look stupid. He fears being embarrassed, right? Absolutely, John. Absolutely. Right. And that there is a definitely revolutionary Irish working class history, up the raw and long live Bobby Sands and all of that, and Joe McDonnell and all of that, but yeah, that's, Bill O'Reilly is very much a narcissist and somebody, somebody who's wanted to be on TV his whole life, really likes his own appearance, that kind of thing, that's, Bill O'Reilly is your narcissist kind of. And that's why he like flies off the handle when being challenged, right? I mean, there's many clips of Bill O'Reilly losing it. We can pull up one of those clips, right? The night is young, folks. I mean, I go on here as long as it takes. So there we go. Bill O'Reilly. And let me see if I can pull up this clip. Oh, we don't have time for that. Anyway, but Bill O'Reilly is a different kind of person, right? So there's Bill O'Reilly. So then Glenn Beck is from a completely different. Glenn Beck is a completely different animal, right? It's almost like there's a sliding scale. So you have Rush, who's just your mean neocon guy. Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity, working, Irish guys who are playing up this working class aesthetic, the cop and fireman, but this kind of anti-establishment thing and whatever. Glenn Beck is a completely different animal. Glenn Beck was a shock jock here in New York, right? He's a German American. He's from a wealthy background. All of these people are, right? To get up in mainstream media, they're all from like wealth. They all went to elite schools. These kind of jobs are very competitive. They all try to give you a rags to riches story, but it's bullshit, right? Very few mainstream media personalities didn't grow up in the lap of luxury. Very, very few. But anyway, Bill O'Reilly. Anyway, we're talking about Glenn Beck. So Glenn Beck, German American guy. He's from a upper middle class, wealthy background, and he was like a shock jock in New York City. Right. When they talk about shock jocks, you listen to the radio. It's while people are driving to work in the morning. People, they drink that coffee. They're trying to wake up. And you've got people like Don Imus and you have others. And Glenn Beck used to be on the radio in New York City and he would be coked up. He was using cocaine and he would, in order to have full energy in the morning, he would snort that cocaine and get on there and, just be crazy on the radio. Right. That was Glenn Beck. And he, obviously, substance abuse and addiction is something that has affected many, many people. And I am not one to judge. Right. And, who am I to cast the first stone? And apparently he developed a cocaine addiction. He had developed a serious cocaine problem. So he went into recovery for his cocaine addiction. And he went into recovery. And through his recovery, he was recruited into being a Mormon. Mormonism, the Church of Latter-day Saints. So he joined the Church of Latter-day Saints. Now, the Church of Latter-day Saints is, very, very much, that is the top religion of FBI and CIA. It's FBI and CIA, it's that's the Mitt Romney religion, right? It's very, very well connected. Salt Lake City and Langley and Salt Lake City and the FBI, they work hand in hand. So Glenn Beck, and at first he was at CNN, and he was like a right-wing commentator on CNN. And long story short, he ended up on Fox News. But his program was completely different, just completely different than O'Reilly, Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, right? First of all, he never brought on guests he disagreed with, right? That was one of the big things. O'Reilly's whole thing is he brought on guests he disagreed with. And he's like, I think that the Democrats are working for the terrorists. Am I wrong? and then the guest would say, well, Bill, you are wrong, actually. Oh, really? Well, I think, and it was like a back and forth. Beck never did that on his show. Never. Beck would give sermons. That was his thing. He would give these like sermons, right? Where he would just preach, but there were props, right? There were props. Like he would have, have books and he would read to you, or he'd have pictures. He had the famous chalkboard. That was his thing. He would give a sermon, and he came into prominence just after the financial crisis, just after Obama got elected, the financial meltdown. And his whole thing was Obama's a communist, class warfare, class struggle is going to divide America. There's a communist conspiracy to wreck our economy. George Soros. He was digging into the far right stuff. He was digging into John Birch Society, hard right ideology. Neoconservatism had died. The neocon worldview had fallen apart. And so post neocon, you had the rise of, libertarian ideas, Federal Reserve conspiracy theories, stuff like that. And he was the transition away from neoconservatism into Alex Jones territory. He's not where Alex Jones is at. He's still, he's a Mormon. He's got one foot in American establishment. He was against Trump and voted for Ted Cruz, but he's more in the hard right camp, right? Flirting with it. And really, Mormons were really into the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society was this far right-wing group in the early 60s that thought Eisenhower was a communist, thought Kennedy was a communist. That's where the Mormonism, you read None Dare Call It Treason, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, were books that were, written by Mormons that were arguing that the Communist Party had infiltrated the government. We need to fight against, Marxism, and that liberals deep down are communists or something. And, that was kind of where Glenn Beck was going. And he's a really good speaker, and he could give a very inspirational sermon. And then he brings on a guest who agrees with him, who says what he thinks. One thing that's amusing is, I published this book, during our temporary, pause. I published this book, Capitalism Must Be Destroyed. This is the articles I wrote from 2007 to 2015. I wrote an article about Glenn Beck, for the Workers' World newspaper. Glenn Beck was obsessed with the Workers' World Party. I remember during those years, it was weird. When John Edwards was running in the Democratic primary against Obama, right? John Edwards was running against Obama, and John Edwards was emphasizing class struggle, in his campaign. He would say it's about the very rich versus everybody else and stuff like that. And John Edwards was kind of trying to be like a Bernie Sanders, kind of a left populist against the corporations. He was calling for national health care, stuff like that. And I remember on national TV, John Edwards, he was mocking John Edwards, and he said, why doesn't he just put a Soviet star on his head and join Workers' World Party? You can look this up. Like, he actually said this. Why doesn't he put a Soviet star on his head and join Workers' World Party? And he was always showing, articles from Workers' World newspaper. He would put it on. He was obsessed with the Workers' World Party, probably because he was with that, he's the Mormons, the CIA. He was with that division of the deep state that monitors communists. Right. That's why, Ann Coulter makes odd statements. Like, she knows a little bit too much about communists. It's standard for right wingers to think all liberals are communists, to think communists are traitors, that's standard. But every so often you meet somebody on the right who knows a little bit too much. Like Ann Coulter, for example. In one of her books, she references the October League and Mike Klonsky. Who the hell knows about the October League and Mike Klonsky? I mean, we talk about it on here. We're talking about the new communist movement. That's some really obscure inside baseball. Well, if you dig into Ann Coulter's history, Ann Coulter's father was the head of the FBI anti-communist division, Jack Coulter, right? Ann Coulter's father was involved in sending FBI informants to infiltrate the copper miners' unions of Arizona. Ann Coulter's dad probably knew all the different communist groups in America by name. And, that was like dinner conversation around the table. What did you do at work today, darling? Well, today we sent an informant into the October League. We tried to send an informant into the Revolutionary Communist Party, but the communist work, that was probably what he was talking about around the dinner table. Jack Coulter, Ann Coulter's father, that was what he did. He was running the anti-communist division of the FBI. So in Ann Coulter's books, like, she's obsessed with Mumia Abu Jamal. Why? Because that's what communist groups were organizing around. And that's probably her dad was spying on all the communist groups in the 80s and 90s. And, that's, there you go. So that's Ann Coulter, right? And that Glenn Beck, he had this odd obsession with the Workers' World Party and the Revolutionary Communist Party, and this odd obsession with the ML sects, the communist ML sects. And that was probably because he was talking with the anti-communist wing of the deep state. The section of the deep state that monitors these groups is probably who had his ear, which is interesting, which is very interesting, because, and now the right wing doesn't ever talk about those groups. Those groups don't exist. And, and that used to be a thing on the right, like Trevor Loudon, who talks about Caleb Maupin, right? And there was this section of the right wing, David Horowitz and all of that were like tracking what the little tiny communist groups are doing. That's not the case anymore. But Glenn Beck, he was like oddly obsessed with communist groups. He'd be showing pictures of, I remember during the Arab Spring, this was hilarious. During the Arab Spring, 2011, you had the Arab Spring before Occupy Wall Street, the summer of 2011. It was the Arab Spring was happening. So the Arab Spring is happening. And at the Workers' World Party meeting, somebody brought a map. This guy was giving a speech, and he's got a map, and he's showing where Tunisia is. He's showing where Egypt is. So Glenn Beck showed a clip of this on his channel from workers.org, the Workers' World Party website. He's like, you think this started in Tunisia, but it actually started at their office in Manhattan, like the Workers' World Party, this tiny sect of old communist folks, the stodgy old communist group, was leading the Arab Spring or something. It was ridiculous. It was very, very ridiculous. But that's Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck is like a Protestant minister. It's like a pastoral sermon. And it's a self-help kind of motivational speaker. He tells stories from history that are inspirational, right? And sometimes I will listen to a Glenn Beck speech. I'm very interested in public speaking, oratory. I listen to preachers a lot. I listen to politicians. Sometimes I'll listen to a Glenn Beck speech and I'll just be like, what? Like, sometimes I honestly, as much as his delivery is good, his content is like, really? Like, I heard a Glenn Beck speech. It was at CPAC a couple years ago. And Glenn Beck is doing his speech. And he starts telling the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Right? He's just telling the story of, and it's not even the story of the Royal Doll story. He's not even talking about the book. He's telling the story of the movie. And it's like, and he got the golden ticket and he ran and he's just telling the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And he's telling it with a lot of energy. You can tell he's practiced. It's well delivered, but it's like, what? He's just telling the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And then at the end, he's like, and he had the golden ticket. And we have the golden ticket. It's the Constitution. And he starts crying. We have the Constitution. It's the golden ticket. Oh, and he's crying about the Constitution. And I'm just like, wait a second. You made me sit through the whole story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. You didn't make a single political point. And the whole thing was just a build up to, we have the golden ticket and it's the Constitution. It reminded me of that joke, right? What's the old joke that, like, the old joke, the aristocrats, right? That was like, it was like in the vaudeville days. That was a running joke, right? It was very famous, called the Aristocrats, where it's like, it's a joke that builds you up to a punchline that's not funny. And the joke goes on and gets more outrageous and more outrageous. And the audience is like, wow, this must be really, really building up to something. And then the joke is the Aristocrats. That's what I felt like. And he's going through the golden ticket and he's building up and he's like, he's in this whole story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm waiting for him to make any political point. It's like, Glenn, get to the point. So what? I've seen this movie. I saw the movie when I was a kid. I saw the remake with, what's his name? Okay, I get it, right? And I read the Royal Doll book. And finally, he gets to the end and he's like, And we have the golden ticket, the Constitution. And I'm just like, okay. I sat through 17 minutes of Glenn Beck speaking at me for this. Like, I felt cheated. I really felt cheated by that speech. I'll say that much. Glenn Beck, if you're watching, I like some of your material. It's well delivered. That one, not so much. That one, not so much. But there you go. I mean, but yeah, you can read articles I wrote about Glenn Beck during the heyday of his career. Ooh, one more thing to say about Glenn Beck, and then we'll go on to the next country. And then we'll go on to the next super chat. This is really interesting, right? So when it was announced that Glenn Beck's show was leaving Fox News, right? I was living in New York. I was talking with different political people. And I thought, wow, Glenn Beck lost his show. I thought that's a big development because he was like one of the main right-wing commentators and his show it had viewership. Somebody said to me, anti-Semitism. And I thought, really? And they said, yeah, his shows are anti-Semitic. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, it's George Soros. This evil Jew is behind everything. So it's anti-Semitic. And I said, really? And it seems that the word had gone around, not just among liberals, but even among some more right-wing and conservative Jews, that Glenn Beck was anti-Semitic. And there were a couple times he slipped. And he said things that did kind of sound a little bit anti-Semitic. For example, he got on a kick. He got on a kick against liberation theology. He hated liberation theology. The notion that anyone could be a Christian and a socialist was just outrageous. And so in one of his rants against liberation theology, he's talking about how Jesus would never be a socialist. Jesus could, and he looks at the camera and he says, if Jesus had been one of these liberation theology people, he would have made the Jews pay. And he starts screaming in his angry voice, like, he would have made the Jews pay for what they did. And it's like, whoa, like, that's the Christ killer thing. That's the anti-Semitic trope about they killed Jesus or whatever, right? And I mean, that's an anti-Semitic trope in and of itself. And he's shouting about if Jesus would have made the Jews pay, and he has this like angry look on his face. And the Soros thing, anti-Semitism. So after Glenn Beck's contract got canceled, right? He didn't just go off the air. He continued his show for a little while. But I noticed this as his show was like winding down and going off the air. Every episode was about loving Israel. And that was weird. And the person that told me anti-Semitism, I was like, oh, they knew something. Because, yeah, they said it's anti-Semitism. That's why his show's been removed. And I thought that was like a stretch. But then I looked and I saw there were a couple clips where he clearly crossed into anti-Semitic territory. And then as I was watching the show, as he was winding down, all the episodes were about, and he loves Israel. Oh, he loves Israel. And he had a rally in Israel. He like mobilized his fans to go to Israel for a pro-Israel rally. And I was like, oh, wow, that is the line that he crossed. And apparently that I think there's probably a very good case that that's what ultimately was Glenn Beck's fall. That's why he's not on Fox anymore. Is he ultimately, he outed himself as anti-Semitic a few too many times, right? That underneath his standard neocon beliefs, there was some anti-Semitism, and that's interesting to me. And that person who said that's what brought him down, they may have known something. So there you go. So there you go. But apparently, yeah, there started to be a feeling among a lot of even Republican and conservative Jews that this guy is an anti-Semite. And that apparently I wasn't privy to those kind of feelings, but yeah, Glenn Beck, and the fact that every episode he did as he was leaving was like, I love Israel. Please, he was like, please don't cancel me. I promise I love Israel. I'm not anti-Semitic. It's like, ooh, but they weren't canceling. He was always pro-Israel. They weren't canceling his show because he wasn't pro-Israel. He was always pro-Israel, but there were a few times where he slipped in his rhetoric, and you could see some blatant anti-Semitism in his rhetoric, I think. So there you go. Next question. All right. That was a good question, by the way. Tom Tom, shout out to you. That was a great question. I had plenty to say about that. As somebody who works in media and all of that, I'm fascinated by these different TV personalities. What's the deal with socialism done left? Who is that guy? Right? I mean, what's his deal? Right? So he's attacking me over the, the thing, and I responded to him, and he had no arguments, right? Like, and so then he just responded to me like, "Oh, I'm sitting here watching Cowboy Bebop with my girl." What the fuck is Cowboy Bebop? First of all, is that like some anime movie? And it's like, after I debunk, he says I'm a fascist because I think we should have a united front, because he like links me an article saying that class collaborationism is fascist. So then I prove, I'm like, the Bolshevik Revolution was class collaborationist, the Chinese Revolution was class collaborationist, CPUSA was class collaborationist. I debunk that. And then he's shooting back that, like, well, it didn't work. Like the Russian Revolution, because it was class collaborationist, was weak or something. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't make it Nazi. And so then he just shoots back at me. I'm watching Cowboy Bebop with my girlfriend and my pets. I'm too cool to have arguments. I don't know facts. And I was just like, oh, okay. And that just was like, what an ass. I mean, and then they're all like, and then I never mentioned the CIA. Never. I said the reason you're taking so long to respond to me is because you're conferring with someone who's smarter than you. And he's like, oh, you're saying I must be working for the CIA. I said, I never mentioned the CIA. I never mentioned the CIA. So the fact that I say someone's giving you answers, someone smarter than you, I suspected it was somebody like Ben Burgess, right? Because that's Ben Burgess is always telling the bread tubers what to do, right? And he shoots back, the CIA is not telling me what to do. I'm like making fun of that. Like, that's like, wait a second. No one mentioned the CIA. The only person who ever mentioned the CIA in relation to him was him. And then on top of that, he gives me this, I'm too cool to have arguments. I'm watching a movie with my girlfriend. And it's like, fuck you. You know what I mean? It's like, if you're too cool to have arguments, then don't call me fascist. Then stay out of things you don't know about. Right? If you're too cool to know what class collaborationism is, if you're too cool to know why the Chinese and Russian Revolution had class collaboration in it, if you're just too cool to know facts and read history books, then don't try to play that game with me. If you're too cool to play basketball, don't like start playing a game and then halfway through the game drop the ball and say, oh, I'm too cool to play this game. No, you played it for half the game, asshole. Right? And that's always the way out of these people. Right? And it turns into this, like, you're a nerd, you know facts. It's like, yeah, and you're pretending to know facts. And the establishment has pumped you up as the voice of socialism and given you hundreds of views and shares to spew your pro-imperialist crap, and you don't know what you're talking about. Same with Vosh. These guys have no fucking clue what they're talking about. They just, Vosh, will say things like, oh, anyone who's pro-Stalin is the same as a Nazi and stuff. And I'm like, oh, that applies to Langston Hughes. And it's like, these people are not qualified for the position that they have. They're just pumped up because they're pro-imperialists. And then whenever they start to lose an argument, they're just like, oh, you're a nerd. You know stuff. It's like, yeah, fuck you. Yeah, I know what you're supposed to know. I know what someone in your position is supposed to know, you fucking idiot. It's like, it'd be like a doctor, like making fun of another doctor. Human anatomy. It's like, shit, I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to, right? Caleb, socialism. What a nerd. It's like, if I'm teaching socialism on the internet, I'm supposed to know it, you fucking asshole. Like, it's just like, I'm sorry for knowing about what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? Like, these people don't know what they're talking about. They know how to smoke weed. They know how to look at porn. They know how to play video games. They know that there's a bunch of people they disagree with that are all Nazis. They don't know anything about Marxism, anything about Leninism, anything about any of this stuff. And as soon as you start to school them on any of this, they just get into this, yeah, well, you're a nerd because you know it all. Fuck you, right? Fuck you. Don't be, if you think it makes you a nerd to know human anatomy, don't be a doctor, right? If you think it makes you a nerd to know the anatomy of dogs, don't become a veterinarian. It's just like, yeah, I know a lot more about this stuff than average people do. And I'm not in this to lord my knowledge over other people and put other people down. I'm in this to teach, right? I'm in this to teach people the history of this ideology. And you're doing that because you've been appointed by the American establishment to misteach, to miseducate. That's what you're there doing. You are miseducating people, and you don't know what you're talking about. And so if I know more than you do, that doesn't make me a nerd. That means I take my job more seriously than you do. That's what it means. So fuck you, SDL. Fuck you. All right. Socialism done loser. Anyway, how did the Soviet government lose its base in society? It didn't. It didn't. Right? At the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, they took a vote, and the majority of the population wanted to keep the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party won the control of the parliament, the 1993 election. It won, I think the 1996 presidential election was stolen. I mean, the Boris Yeltsin only got reelected because of rigging by the imperialists. So, an intervention and, electoral interference by Bill Clinton and others got Boris Yeltsin reelected in 96. The issue wasn't that they lost the population. The issue was rather that the population was depoliticized. Overall, at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, most people, again, they took a vote. They voted to keep the Soviet Union, especially in the smaller republics. They voted to keep the Soviet Union. The Communist Party was still popular and all of that. The vote to the issue wasn't that they had lost popular support. The issue was that people didn't feel like going out and fighting for them. That's the issue, is that Black September, when it mattered, right? 1993, the constitutional crisis, the Communist Party, they were able to get some people out in the street. They weren't able to mobilize what was needed. I mean, at that point, in order to defeat counter-revolution, you would have had to mobilize all of society. You would have needed a strike all throughout the country. You would have needed an uprising all throughout the country, and they were not capable of mobilizing that. People agreed with them, but they weren't willing to go out and, it's like, okay. One of the saddest stories I ever heard from the Soviet Union was somebody told me about they visited a factory. And, they were visiting a factory. They were talking with people. They were talking with somebody. And then, and this guy said, he said, I liked the communists. Things were better when the communists were in power, but I really wish they would have let me eat with them. I heard this story. What did he mean? Well, at this factory in the Soviet Union, if you were a member of the Communist Party, you got to sit at a special table. You got to eat nicer food than everybody else. People resented that, and so this worker said, yeah, things were better when the Communist Party was in power, but I wish they would have let me eat with them. That's kind of sad, isn't it? And that's one of the problems of bureaucracy, right? That the party, the party bureaucracy, there was a level of elitism in the party bureaucracy where, if you were a Communist Party leader, you got a fancy car and you got a high wage, and that bureaucracy, there was a feeling among a lot of the population that the Soviet bureaucracy, they're kind of assholes. They're kind of elitist. Yeah, it was better when the Soviet Communist Party was in power, but they were kind of selfish assholes. They were in it for themselves. That was a widespread feeling. Even among people who voted to keep the Soviet Union, there was a widespread feeling like, yeah, we don't want free market capitalism, but these guys are kind of assholes. And that was the demoralization that set in. Right? It came from the bureaucratism. It came from Yezhovshchina and the Great Terror, and this feeling that, that if you got too involved in politics, you might end up in a prison camp, and that there was kind of a depoliticization and a demoralization on the part of the population. That happened. So, and there was demoralization on the part of the population, that a lot of the population felt like the Communist Party was corrupt. They felt like the Communist Party was, they were in it for themselves, so that's an important thing. That's an important thing. All right. The Chinese government is actively pursuing exactly the same kind of united front against imperialism. That is true. That is true. And I mean, that's what they understand, right? And that, I mean, it's just basic, right? If you understand how imperialism develops, right now we're in a period where the imperialist system is destroying the Western capitalist homelands. So that the logical conclusion is an alliance with the forces that still believe in growth and want to trade with Russia and China. That's like the logical alliance. And these people are sitting there, oh, no, you can't align with industrial capitalists. That makes you a Nazi. How many of these that makes you a Nazi things do they have, right? If I announced I was a vegetarian, they'd say, aha, Nazi dog whistle. You can't say banker. Let's get through it. If I mention finance capital, I'm a Nazi because that's supposed to be code for Jew, even though the majority of wealthy banking families are not Jewish. If I say I'm against the bankers, that means I'm a Nazi. Now I say I'm for the industrialists. That also means I'm a Nazi. Like there's like this, like, I mean, I can't win, right? I guess I'm against, okay, whatever. But I mean, it's just like, how many of these, this makes you a Nazi do they have? They got a million of these. This makes you a Nazi, right? If you believe if you glorify leaders from the past, like John Brown and Huey Newton, Nazi, right? I mean, they've got this silly like Umberto checklist that means if you're a part of any real mass movement, you're a Nazi, right? That's what it means. So there you go. There you go. There you go. All righty. Discuss the situation in Syria and why Israel wants to decimate the Syrian population. Well, Syria is a stronghold against Western capitalism and imperialism. It's an anti-imperialist country. So yeah, I mean, Syria is a stronghold of development in the Arab world. It's built power plants and hydroelectrical facilities. It's expanded agriculture. I mean, the Syrian Arab Republic was a stronghold of anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism. It gave a lot of support to the Palestinians. It gave a lot of support to, the Palestinian Authority was like being housed at one point by the Syrian Arab Republic. The Syrian Arab Republic was a country where you had different religious groups, Sunnis, Shias, Christians living together in peace. Yeah, wrecking Syria was a very important part of maintaining the power of Western capitalism and Zionism, right? Israel saw Syria as a stronghold of resistance to Zionism. So there you go. I don't know about Huey Newton's girlfriend, who had a foster dad who was CIA. I know that towards the end, some weird stuff happened with Huey Newton. Like he got into a fight with a woman and then he fled to Cuba and then he came back, and that, he was using drugs, and that prior to Huey Newton's death, things were getting weird in Huey Newton's life. I know that. And that, that the pressure of being the leader of a Black revolutionary organization, being subject to COINTELPRO, having been on death row, facing execution, and then being freed, and that he started losing his mind during the final years, which is complete. I mean, the amount of pressure he was under as a Black revolutionary in the heart of imperialism. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, he started deteriorating. He started using drugs, and that towards the end, Huey Newton, things got weird. And I don't know about that specific thing you mentioned, but it's very sad, but Huey Newton was probably, a lot of people say he was probably autistic to some degree or other. He was like a political genius. And if you look at interviews with him, the way he speaks, and the way he kind of doesn't make eye contact, people think he may have been somewhat on the spectrum. And he was a brilliant tactician and organizer. And even when he was a criminal, he was like a brilliant criminal. In order to pull off the kind of crimes that he pulled off, you have to be really intelligent. And this is somebody who was really, like, his IQ was very high. He knew how to get shit done, how to design political operations. He was a brilliant organizer and all of that. But people talked about how Huey Newton, there was something kind of off about him because, and that, he was one of these people that's very, very intelligent, but then he was very, very intelligent, and he was subjected to a huge amount of pressure by the American government. And then towards the end of his life, things weren't going well. And do we classify Ireland as an anti-imperialist country? Ireland, I would argue, is currently under the domination of Western European capital, right? I would argue that the French and the British and the German imperialists kind of dominate it. But, Sinn Féin is an anti-imperialist party that is aligned with Venezuela, that is aligned with the Palestinians. There are forces within the government of Ireland that are full-on anti-imperialist. Sinn Féin is a full-on anti-imperialist force. The Workers' Party of Ireland, other groups. There are groups that have a role in the Irish government that are anti-imperialist. But the Irish state, the Irish state, I would not argue is an anti-imperialist state. It's not. Not that there's not a significant role for anti-imperialists in Ireland, right? There's but yeah, I would argue that Ireland is under the domination of Western European capital. It's, and if you look at the way they vote at the UN, et cetera, it's not anti-imperialist, right? There is a huge amount of support for Palestine in Ireland. There is a huge amount of support for Latin American socialist countries. There's a lot of opposition to British imperialism. But overall, the Irish state is not an anti-imperialist state. There are anti-imperialist forces in it. And Sinn Féin is a lot more anti-imperialist than you would think. They don't emphasize it. But the fact that they send representatives to Maduro's inaugurations, the fact that they don't recognize Israel, they condemn Israel, they don't recognize Israel as a country, there's a revolutionary side to Sinn Féin that they don't like to emphasize, but it absolutely exists. So very good, very good. All right, folks. On that note, I will end the stream for tonight. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.